Hello everyone, I know you watched this video to accompany you to sleep. So if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, don't forget to tell me where you are from and what time you watched this video. Let's jump straight into the story. Story 1. Today, I'm going to introduce you to a case from the United Kingdom. I will tell about the events of 2012, which took place in the small village of Sale, located near Manchester. Patricia and Robert Seddon had been married for many years. They married in 1966 and had lived in Timperley since the beginning of their marriage. Bob worked at the airport, where he was mainly in charge of loading suitcases onto planes while his wife was a cleaner. They were modest but happy people, and their happiness was even greater when the couple's children came into the world. A year after the marriage, their son Stephen was born, followed 2 years later by daughter Leslie. It seemed that Rob and Pat had everything important in life: a supportive partner, healthy children, and a job that may not have paid exceptionally well, but enough to provide for their basic needs. Except that when Leslie was 7 years old, it turned out that she was not as healthy as initially thought. She was diagnosed with epilepsy, and this caused her parents to devote much more time to her. It is unclear whether the fact that they focused mainly on Leslie at the time, automatically not devoting enough time to Stephen, wasn't the main reason that the boy started hanging out with the wrong company. He started hanging out with people who led him on the wrong path, and the boy began causing his parents a lot of trouble. He engaged in petty theft, which only caused him problems. It happened more than once that the boy was caught by the police, but every time he did something illegal, Patricia forgave him. Perhaps she felt guilty for not devoting enough time to him, which made Stephen start looking for people who were able to spend as much time as he needed. In any case, at home, he did not have to fear any consequences of his actions, and it seemed that the boy would not make the best in life, that he might always be in trouble with the law. But when he was in his 20s, he moved out of the family home and settled in Manchester, where he and a friend set up a consulting firm called European Business Support. They were in the business of advising on available grants for small businesses. They searched for all possible funding from both the UK and the European Union. They charged a fee of £300 for such a service. And in fact, they had no shortage of clients, making their company grow very well. Stephen and his friend were earning more and more. They could not complain about lack of cash. Things were also getting better for Stephen in his personal life. Seddon met his wife, Nicola, an ex-model from the Sunderland area, in a lap dancing bar in Manchester. Immediately after their marriage, the couple settled in the northeast of England, in the town of Seaham, more than 200 kilometers from his family home. This meant that Stephen no longer saw his parents as often due to the distance between them. And Pat and Bob lived in Sale, the village they moved to after Bob's mother died. When she died, the couple decided to buy the house she had previously occupied. It was larger than the one they had previously rented. Plus, it meant they were no longer stuck with renting, and the couple continued to live there together with their daughter Leslie. After Stephen moved away further with his wife, a new family member arrived in Bob and Pat's house. Leslie gave birth to a son, but the boy was not completely healthy. He was born with a disability and required constant care from Leslie and her parents at all times since his birth. Both Patricia and Robert tried to help their daughter raise the child. They realized that she might not be able to cope on her own, unlike her brother, who was doing well running a business that was becoming increasingly profitable. In the 2 years of the company's existence, Stephen and his partner raised more than £5 million from money paid to them by owners of other companies. For finding funding, Stephen then enjoyed life as much as he could. He drove a Bentley, took his wife on luxury vacations where they always stayed in the most expensive hotels, and even bought himself a small yacht. His parents were very proud of him for achieving such success. Only it soon turned out that not everything was as perfect as it looked from the outside. The problem was that Stephen, along with his partner, were happy to charge clients a fee for their work. Only they never did any of it. They didn't seek out any funding. They simply informed their clients after a while that there was no funding for their company. And in this way, without doing anything, they received £300 from each client. Stephen was very convincing in what he was doing. Most people believed what he was telling them, but eventually there were a few people who began to suspect that something wasn't right there. And when the labor inspectorate started looking into everything, the truth began to come out. And in 2000, Stephen stood trial, accused of fraud and defrauding money, and was sentenced to a year in prison for it. His parents were very much affected by this. The fact that their son was in prison was a personal tragedy for them. They thought that this period, when he was getting into all sorts of trouble, was behind him. They didn't expect to have to visit him in prison after they thought he had gotten back on his feet. But a few years later, in 2008, it turned out that this was not the greatest tragedy to befall them. One day Pat and Bob were sitting in the kitchen with their grandson Daniel, waiting for Leslie to come down and have breakfast with them. Since she wasn't coming down, Pat decided to go to her bedroom. Maybe she wasn't awake yet, although that was unlike her. And when she stood in front of her daughter's bedroom door, Leslie didn't answer at all. So Pat went inside and noticed her daughter. Then the 40-year-old was already dead, having had an epileptic seizure during the night, which led to her death. Bob and Pat experienced their daughter's death terribly. They knew she had been ill, but they didn't expect the illness to take their daughter so early. However, despite the terrible pain they felt after her death, they realized they had to be strong for her son. Daniel was 12 years old at the time, but due to his disability, he required constant care from. However, they had no intention of placing him in any center. They were already in their 60s, but still had enough strength to take care of his upbringing and care. At first, they took care of him 7 days a week, but over time, they decided to let the boy spend a few days a week with a caregiver. He was then cared for by the same caregiver during the day, and Pat and Bob had some time for themselves during that time. They were able to relax a bit or go about their business, especially since in addition to taking care of their grandson's upbringing, they were also helping their son, who was struggling to get off on the right foot after getting out of prison. He was unable to find himself a job that he could hold on to for the long term. As soon as he managed to find one, he worked there for a short period and eventually gave up. There were often periods in his life when Stephen was unemployed. Pat and Bob knew that he was not doing very well. They wanted to help him somehow get a fresh start in life after getting out of prison. So they decided to give him their savings, plus take out a loan to buy a house for their son. Maybe once he has his own place, maybe then it will be easier for him. And the couple gave Stephen a considerable amount of money. It is reported differently. According to some sources, it was £23,000, and according to others, £40,000. Whatever the real amount was, Pat and Bob gave their son as much savings as they could. They were anxious for him to finally put his life together somehow. And with their help, Stephen moved in with his wife and 3 children in a small but his own home. He was very grateful to his parents for their help. He knew that without what they had done for him, it would have been much harder for him. The house may not have been a dream come true, but he owned it. And Stephen, with his wife, no longer had to worry about paying rent. He greatly appreciated what Pat and Bob had done, and to thank them for everything, he decided to invite them and Daniel to dinner at the restaurant. Since Mother's Day also fell at that time, he decided to combine the 2 occasions and spend a nice evening with his family. And on the 20th of March, 2012, the 46-year-old drove a rental car up to his parents' house. He couldn't come with his own because something had broken down in it, and he had to drive it to a mechanic. They all got into that car and drove toward the restaurant. However, while they were driving, Stephen suddenly felt bad. His parents saw that his hand was on his chest and guessed that he might have some heart problems. But Stephen was driving all that time. It was clear that his condition had deteriorated to the point where he was unable to concentrate on the road. And this unfortunately led to the car driving into a canal beside the road. Fortunately, the whole incident was seen by a woman who was driving on the same road as Stephen with his family, and she immediately called for help. She did not see anyone get out of the car before it began to plunge into the water. Only after a while did those on the shore notice that one man managed to free himself from the car. This was Stephen, who, holding onto the roof, tried to rescue his parents and Daniel. He kicked the car windows with all his strength with his legs. But when the car is in the water, it is not so easy to break them. However, before police officers arrived at the scene, Stephen managed to pull Daniel out of the sinking car. He left him on the shore in the care of the people there and immediately returned to the water to try to save his parents. By then, police officers had already arrived at the scene and helped him. Bob was taken out of the car first, but Pat was still there, sitting in the back seat. The only way to save her from there was to break the rear window of the car. And that's how police officers and firefighters, who also arrived at the scene of the accident, managed to take the woman out of the BMW. Only that Pat had been underwater for some time and was already unconscious. She had to be taken to the hospital immediately. The other people who had previously been in the car seemed to be feeling fairly well. Stephen and Bob answered questions from police officers about the accident. But when Stephen recounted what happened, that he suddenly felt a rather severe pain in his chest, after which he was unable to control the car. The pain returned again. The man fell to the ground, and he also was taken to the hospital for further examination. These did not reveal any problems, however, and it was difficult for doctors to determine what had happened to Stephen earlier. It was certainly not a heart attack of any kind, and after various tests were performed, he was discharged home. Unfortunately, his mother had to remain in the hospital. Her condition was critical, and the doctors did everything in their power to save her life. And apparently, Pat was a strong woman, because after some time, her condition began to improve. And after spending a few days in a hospital ward, she was also able to happily return to her home. All the residents of Sale and the surrounding villages had heard about what had happened by the canal. They knew that Stephen, despite the fact that he himself was not feeling well, immediately began rescuing his family members after leaving the car. The story also caught the interest of the local media, which were eager to spread the word about Stephen's heroic act. Interviews appeared with the 46-year-old who recounted the entire incident. Stephen became a local hero, saving his family, but the incident left a big mark on Pat and Bob. It was difficult for them to return to everyday life after the incident. All the time they had before their eyes, what happened that evening. It was not easy to forget it. Both of them had problems with insomnia, and if they did manage to fall asleep, they were then tormented by nightmares related to the accident. It was apparent that they were still reliving what had happened at the time. Those who knew them knew that they were no longer the same people. They both began to have depressive states, even though they really tried to forget the whole accident. But because they had been taking care of Daniel all along, they knew they had to get over it, at least for his sake. Only it wasn't all that easy. More months passed, and the couple still failed to return to their previous mental state. Roughly 3.5 months after the accident, on July 6, 2012, Daniel returned home with his caregiver after a break lasting a few days. Usually, it was the case that when he appeared in front of the house, Pat would stand in the window and wave to him, and Bob would stand in front of the house waiting for his grandson. This time, however, neither of them could be seen, with neither Pat in the window nor Bob in front of the house. And what was even stranger, when the boy's caregiver rang their doorbell, no one answered. The man went to see if they were in the garden behind the house, but they were not there either. Puzzled by the whole situation, he looked inside through the window, and what he saw made him immediately reach for the phone and call the emergency number. Through the window, he saw Bob sitting on the couch, but what scared him was that he was holding a gun. When police officers arrived at the couple's home, they went inside, and the first thing they saw was Patricia lying on the floor in the hallway. The woman was dead, and the wound located on her head indicated that someone had earlier aimed a gun at her and pulled the trigger. Bob was located on the couch, as described by Daniel's caregiver. In his case, the wound was at chest level. He also was already dead. All indications were that the couple was unable to cope after the death of their daughter and after what happened on the way to the restaurant. The incident led to their mental state definitely deteriorating, and they decided to take their own lives. Was it a joint decision, or was it just Bob's decision to kill his wife before taking his own life? That, unfortunately, could not be determined. People who knew Pat and Bob well were shocked when they heard of their deaths. They knew that the last few months had not been the easiest for them, but they also knew that they were responsible people, who had been involved in raising their grandson. It seemed that they would not leave him alone. Or maybe they were guided by the fact that they had spoken to Stephen earlier after Leslie's death, who declared that if anything happened to them, he would take care of Daniel. Perhaps with this knowledge, they could afford to leave this world. Whatever their reasons, their friends and family found it difficult to come to terms with what had happened. Everything pointed to the fact that Bob had taken the life of his wife, and then himself. However, police officers had to check everything on the spot to rule out the involvement of third parties. And when their attention was drawn to the wound located on Bob's chest, it turned out that there was no way he had pulled the trigger himself. The bullet that hit the man was fired from a distance of 1.5 meters from him, the size of the wound indicated. Also, the positioning of the gun itself confirmed that it could not have been Bob. It was lying on the man's lap. If in fact he had been the one to pull the trigger, it would most likely have been lying on the floor somewhere. And if it wasn't Bob who killed them, they didn't seem to be people who had any enemies wishing them dead. Police officers, as they continued their investigation, talked to everyone who knew the couple, with their family, friends, neighbors, and even their family doctor. And it was a conversation with the doctor where Bob was treated that shed a completely different light on the whole case. It turned out that Bob had seen him shortly before his death, and during that visit, he shared with the doctor his concerns about the accident a few months earlier. In all the time that had passed since they drove the car into the canal, he had been thinking a lot about it, and the longer he thought about it, the more certain he became that it was not a normal accident. Bob told the doctor about how he was at his son's house shortly after the incident, and there he noticed a document saved on his TV about what to do in case the car ended up in the water. It seemed very strange to him, whether it could have been a coincidence or maybe his son was trying to kill them all, and in order to get away with it himself had prepared for it beforehand. Bob had a feeling that it was more likely the latter, that for some reason, Stephen wanted to kill them. The doctor, when he heard about the man's suspicions, suggested that maybe he should report it to the police. But Bob didn't want to do that. He said he needed to talk to his own son about it himself. This conversation with the family doctor made the police officers begin to take Stephen into account as the perpetrator of the crime. Previously, they hadn't even thought about it. Immediately after talking to the doctor, the man was arrested and brought to Manchester, where he was questioned. Stephen was very outraged by all this. How could the police officers even suspect him of this? After all, they were his parents. However, in order for investigators to rule out his involvement in the crime, they needed to establish the time when it occurred. Stephen could provide an alibi for that day, and in the course of the investigation, they were able to establish some information that helped determine the time frame in which the couple was killed. That every Wednesday the residents of the street where the couple lived put waste containers in front of the house, which were emptied on Thursday. They remembered that no such trash container appeared in front of Pat and Bob's house on Wednesday, July the 4th. The neighbors also knew that Pat hung out laundry in the garden every day, and she did the same thing every day. In the morning, she would hang out the white clothes, and when those dried, then she would hang the darker ones. On Wednesday, July 4th, only white clothes appeared on the dryer. No one took them off or hung the dark ones. On the surveillance cameras in sale, police officers were able to catch a glimpse of Bob as he left fish and chip shop a few minutes after 12 o'clock on the same 4th of July day. When he got home, he still picked up the phone and finished talking at 12:24 p.m. That was his last call. When someone called his landline again at 4:21 p.m., neither he nor Pat answered the call. This gave police officers a 4-hour window when the murder could have occurred. Stephen insisted all along that he was innocent. He wasn't the one who killed his parents and had no idea why he would do it. He also had an alibi for the day when police officers believed the murder occurred. 2 days earlier on Monday, he and his entire family had gone to the seaside for a few days. The place was nearly a 3-hour drive away from his home. While he was there on Tuesday evening, he was reminded that he had to appear at the job center the next day for an appointment. Stephen had no choice. Wednesday morning after 5 o'clock, he had to get in the car and make the 3-hour trip back home. When he got there, he had time to drink a cup of coffee, and as 10 o'clock approached, he left the house to go to the office. Only then he was in for an unpleasant surprise. Because there was a power outage at the time, Stephen was unable to open the gate to the garage where his car was parked. He had no choice then. Not wanting to be late, he ran as fast as possible to be on time. At the office, he took care of everything that needed to be done and immediately returned home. Since the electricity was still out, he went to bed, and when he woke up, he could already open the gate to the garage. Therefore, he immediately returned to Fleetwood, where his family had been staying the entire time. Police officers checked the location of his phone, and it confirmed his words. His phone was located in Siam for almost the entire day. His words were also confirmed by employees of the job center. They saw Stephen on Wednesday at 10 a.m. And those employees remembered well that he came to that meeting out of breath as he had to run all the way from home. Did all this mean that he was innocent after all, and that Pat and Bob had been killed by a completely different person? It looked like it, but the police officers, in the course of investigating and confirming Stephen's alibi, came across something that piqued their interest. Since he testified that he had been at the job center that day, investigators checked surveillance footage located on the office building. This footage also confirmed Stephen's earlier words. At around 10 a.m., he appeared in the building. Only the investigators were interested in something else. They noticed that moments before Stephen appeared on this footage, a car was parked on the street near the office, and it was from that direction that Stephen came. And when he came out of the office, he walked toward that car, and a moment later, the vehicle drove away. Police officers were unable to determine whether the man got into that car or whether it was just a coincidence. The camera only covered a portion of this vehicle, and investigators were unable to determine this. It would have been a big coincidence, however, that at the exact time Stephen arrived at the office, someone parked this car, and when he left the office, then drove away. Unfortunately, the footage did not make it possible to determine either the license plate number of this car or even what make it was, only that police officers noticed on the recording that at the time this car was parked there, a bus was passing along the street perpendicular to the street where it was standing. Buses are equipped with cameras, and perhaps one of them captured this vehicle. And here the police officers are not wrong. After checking the camera footage of this particular bus, it was noted exactly what kind of car it was. It was already known that it was a blue BMW, but somehow this footage did not allow them to determine the number in the registration of this car. But in the course of conversations with Stephen's family and friends, it was quickly determined to whom the car belonged. The man's brother-in-law admitted that on that Wednesday when Pat and Bob were killed, Stephen showed up at his house in the morning and asked him to borrow the car, a blue BMW exactly like the one seen on the video. And the man lent him the car, and Stephen returned it only after a few hours. That is, it turned out that the 46-year-old had access to a car and did not move around the city on foot as he kept assuring police officers. He also had the ability to travel the route from the city where he lived to the village where his parents lived. The one-way route may have taken him 2.5 hours, but he was able to do it. The investigators just needed to find confirmation that the borrowed BMW was in the sale area that day. And once they had the license plate numbers of that car, it was much easier. The automatic license plate recognition system immediately indicated the route the car had taken. That day, someone was driving this car from Seaham toward Manchester, on the outskirts of which Bob and Pat lived. At 1:35 p.m., this car was visible on the street near Pat and Bob's house. It was moving in the direction of the couple's home. 28 minutes later, the same camera recorded a blue BMW coming from the direction where Pat and Bob lived. And the license plate recognition system indicated that this car took the opposite route to the earlier one. From Manchester, someone was driving in the direction of Siam. And since Stephen was in possession of that BMW at the time, there was no doubt that he was the one driving the car. However, why would he kill his parents? After all, they were the kind of parents that many people could envy. They helped him as much as they could. Thanks to them, he had a house to live in with his entire family. What would be the motive for this crime? Investigators were also interested in whether the car accident, which occurred a few months before the couple's death, was actually an accident, or perhaps Bob was right, and Stephen was already trying to kill them. And police officers began to look into the case. Witnesses to those events were interviewed, as well as the reports from that evening were carefully checked. And it turned out that Stephen managed to free himself from the sinking car rather quickly, because there was a knife in his pocket, with which he had cut the seatbelt. When Bob was at his last appointment with his family doctor and told him about his doubts about the accident, he also mentioned at the time that he had pointed out that there was a steering wheel lock in the car, which was later used by Stephen to break the glass in the door. Bob was a little surprised that such a lock was there, because it was a very modern car, having an immobilizer, and this type of device seemed to be unnecessary there. Stephen used it after the accident to break the glass in the door to get out of the car. But why didn't he do the same with the windows located by the other passengers? Surely this way, it would have been easier for him to break the glass than by kicking with his shoe. Police officers spoke again with people who witnessed the whole incident. And according to their words, Stephen climbed onto the roof of the car immediately after exiting the car, which caused it to begin to submerge faster. The people on the shore kept shouting to him to get off the car, because doing so would only accelerate the sinking of the car. But it took a while for Stephen to actually do so. It should also be remembered that the tests that were done on him that day in the hospital showed nothing that could cause chest pain. There was no medical explanation for what supposedly happened to him. Another suspicious thing was that Stephen had purchased additional insurance for this car. When he rented the vehicle, he decided to buy insurance in case there was some kind of accident. When he had previously happened to rent a car from the same rental company, never additional insurance was purchased. Only in this one case. The gun that Patricia and Robert were killed with was stolen from a man living in a village near Seaham, the town where Stephen lived. It had been stolen some time earlier, and the only explainable way how it ended up at the other end of the country is that Stephen drove it there. All this could not have been a coincidence. Bob was right. Their son was trying to take their lives at the time, only most likely his plans were thwarted by witnesses, who happened to be by the canal at the time. Only if there had been no one there, he probably would not have tried to save them at all. He didn't succeed then, but 3.5 months later, he was more successful. After taking all the information about the two incidents, 8 days after he killed his parents, the police arrested Stephen. In the course of the trial, which began in February 2013, in addition to all the evidence previously gathered, a possible motive for the crime was also presented. Of course, it was all about money. After Leslie's death, Stephen became the sole heir of Pat and Bob. They changed their will, in which everything they owned was left to him. Stephen promised them that if something happened to them, he would take care of Daniel. Knowing this, they were able to peacefully bequeath all their property to him. The house they lived in was worth £230,000, and Stephen knew exactly how much he could use the money for. At the time this crime occurred, he was unemployed, which was not unheard in his case. But he wanted to change that, and an opportunity came along to do so. There was a pub in the village where he lived, and its owner was going to sell it. Stephen then thought that he could become the new owner of the place. He had already discussed the subject with the owners of this pub, and they had even agreed that Stephen would buy the premises from them. Only the owners didn't realize that he didn't have sufficient funds for such a purchase. His bank account contained about £5. His financial situation could only change if something happened to his parents. If they died, he would receive their house and all their savings. This would probably allow him to buy the pub of his dreams. Stephen didn't admit to killing his parents. He testified that he actually borrowed a car from his brother-in-law that day and drove it to Manchester. It's just that he had to go there to buy illegal substances. That was also the reason why he hadn't admitted to it before. The jury, however, did not believe his statements. Stephen lied from the very beginning, and it was only thanks to the work of the police that all the lies were exposed. After 18 hours of deliberations, the jury found him guilty of murdering Pat and Bob, as well as the earlier attempt to take their lives. For this, he was sentenced to double life imprisonment, with the possibility of early parole, only after spending 40 years in prison. Considering that at the time of the crime, Stephen was 46 years old, he will not be released earlier than the age of 86 if he lives to that age. Story 2. Shadows over Maputo. The early morning sun poured like molten gold over Maputo's crumbling facades, casting long shadows on the cracked streets where the city's heartbeat pulsed with a restless urgency. In the bustling markets, vendors shouted over each other, hawking everything from vibrant fabrics to fresh seafood, their voices weaving into a chaotic symphony that masked the darker currents running beneath the city's surface. Beneath this apparent normalcy, an invisible war was raging, a clash of power, greed, and survival where the stakes were nothing less than life and death. João Matola, a former detective-turned-private investigator, knew this world all too well. Once a decorated officer in the National Criminal Investigation Service, he had walked away after a brutal ambush that left his partner dead and his faith shattered. Now, with his badge long surrendered and the weight of the past heavy on his shoulders, João navigated the murky alliances and hidden vendettas of Mozambique's capital, where corruption was currency and truth was the rarest commodity of all. That morning, João sat in a cramped cafe near the harbor, nursing a bitter cup of coffee as he watched fishermen haul their catches beneath the skeletal cranes of the port. His mind churned with the fragments of a new case, one whispered about in the underground circles, but dismissed by official channels as mere rumor. It began with the disappearance of a young woman, Annabella Nampasa, the daughter of a prominent politician who had recently fallen out of favor with powerful factions in the city. Officially, the police claimed she had run away, but Joao's instincts told him otherwise. There was something far more sinister at play. Annabella's last known whereabouts were traced to a derelict warehouse in the industrial outskirts of Maputo, a place rumored to be the staging ground for the shadowy networks trafficking everything from weapons to illicit minerals harvested deep in the north. Joao's investigation would not only threaten the fragile balance of power, but expose secrets some would kill to protect. Joao knew the dangers well. Mozambique in 2010 was a country on the cusp of transformation, yet mired in the legacies of civil war and entrenched criminal enterprises. The city was a crossroads for smugglers, mercenaries, and corrupt officials who all operated under a veil of impunity. As Joao prepared to leave the cafe, a shadow fell over his table. He looked up to find a woman whose presence seemed to slice through the humidity and noise, a figure both familiar and unexpected. It was Teresa, an old friend and once a trusted informant who now worked as a fixer for a shadowy security firm linked to foreign investors with deep interests in Mozambique's natural gas reserves. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, betrayed no emotion as she handed João a folded piece of paper. "This isn't just about Annabella anymore," she said quietly, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "There's talk of a shipment, something big, moving through the port tonight. Something that could tip the scales if it falls into the wrong hands." João unfolded the paper to reveal a crude map marked with cryptic symbols and a time, midnight. "You're telling me this ties back to the disappearance?" he asked, voice low. Teresa nodded. "More than that, the woman isn't just a victim. She might be the key to uncovering who's behind it all." João felt the familiar surge of adrenaline mixed with the cold dread that came with stepping back into the underworld he had tried to leave behind. But the stakes were too high to walk away. The disappearance of Annabella Nampasa was no ordinary case. It was a thread that, once pulled, could unravel decades of silence and lies stretching across continents. With a final glance at the port, where container ships loomed like silent giants waiting to swallow secrets whole, João slipped the map into his jacket and melted back into the throng of the waking city, knowing that by nightfall, the true darkness would descend, and with it, the shadows that hid a criminal empire built on blood, betrayal, and broken promises. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a fiery glow over the sprawling cityscape of Maputo, the streets transformed. The cacophony of the daytime market faded into a quieter, more sinister hum, the city's underbelly awakening under the cover of darkness. João Matola moved cautiously through narrow alleys that twisted like veins through the industrial district, the map Teresa had given him folded carefully in his breast pocket. Every step echoed with the weight of uncertainty, every shadow a potential threat. He was a man alone against a web of criminal networks that stretched from the port warehouses to the highest corridors of power. Yet it was here, in this labyrinth of rusted containers and forgotten machinery, that the truth awaited, hidden in plain sight. The port was a place where legality and lawlessness blurred into indistinction. Tonight, the docks were alive with activity under the watchful eyes of armed guards, their silhouettes rigid against the flickering floodlights. João kept to the shadows, moving with practiced stealth, his senses attuned to the slightest movement or whisper. He observed the men loading crates onto a massive cargo ship destined for distant shores, crates that were said to hold more than just manufactured goods. Rumors of illicit weapons, rare minerals mined from the northern provinces, and even human lives being trafficked for profit hung in the air like a thick fog. His informants had been clear. Something big was moving through Maputo tonight, something that could ignite the fragile peace Mozambique was struggling to build. João's heart pounded as he approached the warehouse marked on the map. The building was a hulking relic of colonial times, its once whitewashed walls now stained and peeling. Inside, the air was thick with the metallic scent of oil and dust. He slipped through a side door left ajar, his eyes adjusting to the dimness. Voices echoed from deeper within, a mixture of Portuguese and local dialects, carrying an urgency that made his skin crawl. Peering around a stack of crates, João spotted Annabella. She was alive but bound, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and defiance. Nearby, men armed with automatic rifles paced, their faces obscured by scarves and hats. João's mind raced. This was no ordinary kidnapping. It was a calculated message aimed at more than just Annabella's family. He watched as a man in a dark suit barked orders, clearly the ringleader, orchestrating the operation with cold efficiency. The shipment was tied to a broader conspiracy involving powerful factions vying for control over Mozambique's natural resources and political influence. João realized that exposing this network could topple governments, ignite violence, and unleash chaos on a nation still healing from past wounds. But turning away was not an option. Not now. Not when justice demanded action. He reached into his pocket for his phone, fingers trembling slightly as he dialed Teresa. Her voice was a lifeline in the darkness. "I found her," he whispered urgently, "and it's worse than we thought. They're shipping weapons and minerals connected to corrupt officials. We need backup." Teresa responded with a cold resolve, promising reinforcements from her contacts. Men who operated in the shadows, trusted allies with their own scores to settle. As João waited, he formulated a plan to free Annabella and intercept the shipment, knowing full well that failure meant death. Not just for him, but for anyone who dared stand in the path of this ruthless cartel. Minutes later, The night air was shattered by the roar of engines as black SUVs slid silently into the dockyard. Teresa's team moved like ghosts, blending into the darkness with tactical precision. The tension mounted with every passing second as João prepared to strike, his pulse steady despite the chaos within. The confrontation that followed was brutal and swift. Gunfire erupted, metal clashed, and shadows danced with lethal intent. João fought with a desperation fueled by years of loss and regret, each moment a test of his resolve and skill. In the fray, Annabella broke free, stumbling toward safety as her captors fell one by one. But the true battle was only beginning. The shipment, the secrets, and the people behind it all were still out there, hidden in the labyrinthine corridors of power where crime and politics were entwined in an unholy alliance. As dawn crept over Maputo, washing the city in pale light, João knew this victory was temporary. The forces he was up against were vast and deeply entrenched, and his quest for justice would lead him down darker paths still. But for the first time in years, there was a spark of hope, a fragile flame that might one day illuminate the truth and bring light to a city cloaked in shadows. The sun had fully risen, bathing Maputo in a harsh, unforgiving light that revealed the scars left by the night's violence. Spent shells scattered on the cracked pavement, smoldering remnants of burnt crates, and the silent bodies of those who had paid the ultimate price. João Matola sat on the steps of an abandoned building, his breath ragged, the weight of exhaustion settling into his bones. Annabella was safe for now, hidden away under Teresa's protection, but João knew that safety was fleeting. The deeper he delved into the underworld, the more dangerous his enemies became, their reach extending far beyond the dockyards into the marble halls of power. The conspiracy he had uncovered was not merely about smuggling or ransom. It was a meticulously orchestrated plan to destabilize Mozambique's fragile democracy, fueled by greed and foreign interests hungry for control over the country's vast mineral wealth and emerging gas fields. Corrupt politicians, shadowy businessmen, and armed militias had formed an unholy alliance, using intimidation and violence to silence dissent and maintain their grip on power. João realized that his fight was against an invisible enemy, one that hid behind official titles and diplomatic immunity, wielding influence with the subtlety of a snake ready to strike. As he pieced together the fragments of evidence gathered during the raid, João felt a mix of anger and determination. Every name, every transaction, every coded message was a thread in a tapestry of betrayal that spanned continents. Annabella, once a pawn in this deadly game, was now a beacon of hope, her courage a reminder of the cost of silence. João's thoughts drifted to his late partner, the man who had been ambushed years ago in a similar struggle against corruption and violence. That loss had nearly broken him, but it had also ignited a fire that refused to be extinguished. Now, with Annabella's fate intertwined with his own, João was ready to face whatever came next, no matter the price. The days that followed were a blur of clandestine meetings, coded messages, and narrow escapes. Teresa's network proved invaluable, providing intelligence and muscle in a city where trust was a rare commodity. João met with journalists risking their lives to expose the truth, activists fighting to reclaim their country from the grip of criminal syndicates, and honest officers within the police force who had not yet been bought or broken. Each encounter revealed more layers of deception and danger, but also the resilience of a people yearning for justice. One evening, as João prepared to meet a whistleblower with information that could topple the entire criminal network, he was ambushed once again. Gunshots rang out in the narrow street, and chaos erupted as João scrambled for cover. The attackers were relentless, professionals who knew his every move. But João's survival instincts, honed through years of hardship, allowed him to escape with only a graze to his arm. The message was clear: stop digging or face death. Yet, far from deterring him, the attack only steeled his resolve. He would not be silenced. Mozambique's future depended on it. In the quiet moments before dawn, João stood overlooking the city from a rooftop, the skyline etched against the pale sky. He thought of Annabella, Teresa, and all those caught in the crossfire of this brutal struggle. The path ahead was uncertain and fraught with peril, but for the first time, João believed that change was possible. The shadows over Maputo were deep and dangerous, but even the darkest night must eventually give way to day. And as long as he drew breath, João Matola would be there, fighting in the shadows to bring the light of justice to a land scarred by crime and corruption. Let's jump to next story. Story 3. Shadows of Beira. In the heart of Beira, the humid port city cradled by the Indian Ocean, The rain had fallen for 3 days without pause, turning the alleyways into rivers of mud and cloaking the air with the pungent scent of salt, rot, and iron. It was late April, 2013, and the city simmered beneath a curtain of uncertainty. Beneath the cacophony of diesel engines and honking minibuses, whispers threaded through the slums and waterfront bars. Rumors of disappearances, of floating bodies pulled from the Pung River with their hands bound and eyes gouged, of a new syndicate that didn't play by the old rules. These were not the flamboyant drug lords of Maputo, nor the bureaucratic kleptocrats in Nampula. These were ghosts, merciless and surgical, with no names and no faces, moving through Beira like a cancer in the bloodstream. In a city already strangled by poverty and corruption, they brought a new kind of fear, the kind that turned police stations into morgues and silence into currency. At the center of this storm stood Inspector Elias Tavares, a former soldier turned homicide detective with grizzled hands, a crooked nose broken in 4 places, and a mind sharp enough to see patterns where others saw only blood. He had been born in Beira, orphaned in the Civil War, raised by an uncle who vanished during the floods of 2000, and molded by the city's shifting loyalties. He knew Beira like a sailor knows the tide, its hidden coves, its double meanings, its slippery allegiances, and he knew that whatever was brewing now, it was different. It had started with the Ferreira boy, found stuffed in a fishing net near Macuti Beach, his limbs folded like a doll, his lips sewn shut with nylon thread. Then came the twin brothers, Junior and Alfredo Nunez, middlemen in the shrimp smuggling trade, their boat discovered adrift, the crew butchered below deck with hooks and machetes. The message was clear. This was a cleansing, a hostile takeover from forces unknown. But it was the death of Eligio Mattavili, a mid-level customs official and notorious bribe-taker, that changed everything. He was found in his garage, strangled with piano wire, and a crude map pinned to his chest with a diving knife, an outline of the city marked with 7 red X's. Tavares stared at that map for hours, tracing the blood-soaked creases until something clicked. The XS formed a route, not random killings, but coordinated strikes, each target sitting along an invisible spine that ran from the container yards to the old fish market. There was logic here, ruthless and calculated, like a surgical incision through the city's underbelly. And someone had drawn that line, not for art, but for control. The police commissioner wanted the killings spun as gang retaliation, just more turf war among the unemployed, another cycle in the city's endless loop of violence. But Tavares had seen war, and this wasn't rage, it was design. He took the map to Sofia Lemos, a sharp-tongued investigative journalist at Jornal de Beira, whose brother had vanished 2 weeks prior after filming dock workers unloading unmarked crates at night. She looked at the map, then at Tavares, and said only one word: Quintus. It was a name no one dared say aloud in the city. Joaquim Quintus, Mambane, had once been a major in the intelligence service, a ghost who'd fought in Renamo, and then vanished into the folds of private security contracts. Rumor had it he had returned to Beira with a new crew, ex-mercenaries, Angolan fixers, Russian investors, and that he was carving out an empire behind the smokescreen of port privatization. Everyone knew something, but no one said anything. Not unless they wanted to end up like Mattavili or worse. Tavares wasn't reckless. He'd buried too many friends to be careless, but something about this case clawed at his conscience. This wasn't about smuggling anymore. It was about who got to rewrite the rules of the city, and whether anyone still believed in law when law was sold to the highest bidder. That night, Tavares sat in his car outside the Estaqueo Ferroviaria, watching the night trains rattle by, waiting for a contact Sofia had arranged. A port clerk named Zika, who claimed to have seen Quintus's men offload containers marked with UN stamps, only to disappear into private warehouses. Zika never showed. An hour later, they found him hanging from a crane, his hands chopped off, a warning carved into his chest in Portuguese. Silence is survival. That should have been the end of it, but Tavares couldn't let go. He started working alone, piecing together fragments, phone records, shipping logs, patterns in the killings, and what emerged was terrifying. Dozens of containers had entered the port with forged manifests, routed through Dubai and Durban, declared as medical aid, but they never reached any hospitals. Instead, they vanished into a network of shell companies tied to offshore accounts and real estate purchases in Pemba and Lisbon. At the heart of it all was a firm called Ajima Logistics, registered in Mauritius but operated locally by a figure only referred to as O Fantasma, the ghost. Tavares dug deeper, until someone broke into his flat and stabbed his dog to death, leaving its heart on his kitchen table like a voodoo token. He sent Sophia into hiding and burned every paper trace of the case, keeping only a USB drive hidden in the engine compartment of his Land Cruiser. But it was too late. His name was already on someone's list. That same night, two men in plain clothes tried to snatch him outside a petrol station. He shot one in the leg, left the other with a shattered wrist, and disappeared into the city's fog like a fugitive, now hunted by both sides of the law. Beira had become a jungle, and the hunter had just become the prey. The days that followed blurred into a mosaic of smoke-choked backstreets, clandestine meetings in derelict cafes, and the constant hum of paranoia ringing in Elias Tavares' ears like tinnitus. Beira, once familiar and even comforting in its chaos, now felt like a distorted reflection of itself. Every face potentially a snitch, every moving vehicle a threat, every silence too loud. He no longer slept in the same place twice, hopping between safe houses left over from his military days, half-collapsed structures on the outskirts of Munhava, old fishing cabins near the mangrove forests, and abandoned school buildings still haunted by bullet holes from the Civil War. His phone had long been tossed into the sea, his badge stashed beneath the foundation of a warehouse he knew he'd never return to. The city had turned on him. No official support remained. The commissioner had disavowed him after the petrol station shootout, painting him as a rogue officer whose personal vendetta had compromised the integrity of the department. The newspapers were silent. Even Sophia had gone dark, disappearing into the labyrinth of Maputo's expat alleys, perhaps helped by foreign contacts who owed her favors from previous exposés. Tavares was now alone, surviving on instinct and desperation. But in that solitude, he found clarity. Everything pointed to a single conclusion. Someone was preparing Beira for something massive, and the killings were not just about dominance or revenge. They were about purging the city of those who knew too much or stood in the way of whatever was coming next. He recalled something Zika had said in their first and only conversation, before the man was found swinging from the crane. They're not importing drugs anymore. Not guns. It's people. At the time, Tavares had dismissed it as drunken paranoia. Now it made sense. Through a risky bribe to a junior customs officer named Danilo, an orphan-turned whistleblower who wore his father's watch like a talisman, Tavares acquired shipping manifests that had somehow slipped through the system. One in particular stood out, a consignment declared as disaster relief tents, marked with UN coding, but routed through 3 shell firms before arriving in Beira. When Danilo tracked down the physical container at a rusting depot under the protection of a private security firm, he found it empty, except for blood stains and manacles drilled into the metal floor. The container had been retrofitted for human transport. Smuggling people in 2013 Mozambique wasn't unheard of. Trafficking routes had existed for decades, primarily along the Nacala corridor, but this was industrial, organized, multinational. Someone was turning Beira into a hub, not for drugs or contraband, but for human flesh. Tavares knew what that meant: labor camps, organ trade, black market militias, even private armies built from desperation and silence. The ghost, this O Phantasma, wasn't just consolidating local power. He was building infrastructure for something far worse. That night, Tavares made a choice. He would not live long, not with what he knew. But maybe, just maybe, he could burn the operation before they buried him. The USB drive he'd hidden now held enough data: scans, video footage, altered manifests, payoffs linked to foreign bank accounts, to trigger an international outcry if it landed in the right hands. The question was how to get it out. Foreign journalists were watched. Embassies were infiltrated. The police were hopeless. But there was one man, an old war buddy named Vasco Berganca, now working as a pilot for a dodgy mining company out of Johannesburg, who owed Tavares his life. Vasco flew light aircraft between Malawi and Mozambique, and sometimes forgot to log cargo. Tavares contacted him through a fisherman's radio relay outside Buzi, and they arranged a meeting in a clearing northwest of Dondo. Tavares arrived 2 hours early, hiding beneath a collapsed bush hut, the USB drive sewn into the hem of his pants, his pistol ready. The air was thick with insects and tension. He waited. Then the plane came, a dot on the horizon, then a buzz, then a Cessna dipping low through the tree-line. It circled once, twice, and began to descend. And then, from the forest, came the crack of suppressed gunfire. Not one shot. Several. Controlled. Tactical. The plane lurched in midair, one wing spewing smoke, and it pitched to the right before cartwheeling into the brush with a crunching roar that tore through the jungle like thunder. Tavares didn't move. He stayed buried for another hour as men moved through the wreckage, speaking Portuguese and Russian, their rifles American. One of them had a satellite phone. Another, curiously, wore a priest's collar under his tactical vest. Tavares memorized every face, every voice, even the dog tags one of them wore, probably taken from someone else. When they left, he crept to the wreckage, found Vasco's body slumped over the control panel, and whispered an apology before retrieving the scorched duffel bag that still held 2 spare fuel canisters and a waterproof radio. That radio would be his only salvation. He climbed the ruins of an old Portuguese signal tower at dawn, boosting the frequency until he caught a scratchy South African shipping line at sea, and fed them the coordinates for a floating USB cache he'd rigged inside a waterproof beacon. He dropped it into the Busy River with a prayer, hoping the currents would do what he could not, carry the truth beyond the border. That night, he set fire to the customs warehouse that had held the retrofitted containers. The blaze burned for hours, lighting the Barra skyline like a funeral pyre. Fire brigades were slow to respond, and by the time they did, the building and its contents were ash. It wasn't justice, but it was a start. Tavares knew he had maybe days left. They were coming. The ghost would not tolerate this kind of defiance. But the flames he lit could no longer be ignored. Somewhere, someone would ask why a decorated pilot died in Mozambican jungle, why the customs data vanished, why the fish markets near the port had been shuttered overnight. Maybe Sophia would emerge from exile. Maybe someone in Lisbon or Geneva would follow the money trail. Or maybe not. But if the city had to bleed, then it would bleed with eyes wide open. Let's jump to next story. Story 4. Salt in the Wound. Nampula, Mozambique, 2015. It was a heat that clung to the skin like guilt, wet, sticky, and inescapable. Nampula in late November simmered not just with tropical humidity, but with an undercurrent of something darker, meaner, and more deliberate. For Inspector Joel Simango, a man molded by 2 decades of quietly decaying institutions and slowly rotting ideals, the city had become a suffocating trap. The orange haze over the rooftops each dusk reminded him of the blood-red files that kept piling up on his desk, most of them never to be closed. But one case had clawed its way to the top of his list, a triple homicide behind the Colonial Railway Station. 3 men, all from different provinces, all nameless in the official reports, their bodies dumped behind rusted shipping containers like discarded meat. No IDs, no witnesses, just torn fingernails, broken bones, and empty sockets where their eyes used to be. No one claimed them, and no one dared ask questions. Except Joel, because one of the corpses had a cigarette burn on the sole of the left foot, a mark that Joel had seen before, once, in Cabo Delgado, when he was still young enough to believe in procedural justice. The cigarette mark wasn't random. It was a signature, belonging to a man the force only knew as Moana Wapara, a phantom figure in the North's black market circuits, rumored to run human trafficking routes between Mozambique's coastal towns and foreign interests buried deep in Malawi and Tanzania. Officially, he didn't exist. Unofficially, his name was whispered like a curse among port workers and police alike. Joel remembered a raid in 2008, where they found a container with 12 women and 1 dead boy, face purple from asphyxiation. The only clue then had been that same burn. But the case had vanished within weeks, buried by superiors, blurred by corruption, and forgotten by a press that had bigger headlines to chase. Joel hadn't forgotten, and now, 7 years later, the ghost had returned. He traced the first clue through a string of informants, ex-cons, bribe-hungry customs officials, and an old prostitute named Mariamo, who'd once serviced both politicians and mercenaries. She told him stories of containers sealed with prayer beads and guarded by men who didn't speak any local language. She said the killings were warnings, not messages to the police, but to smugglers who'd tried to go freelance. "There are new buyers now," she'd whispered under the yellow glow of a dying street lamp. "White men with silence in their pockets. They don't want drugs. They want control." Joel took her seriously. Then 2 days later, her body was found floating near the Manapo River, throat cut, tongue missing. The deeper he dug, the more invisible hands pulled at the soil. His calls were tapped, his access to files mysteriously revoked. A disciplinary notice appeared at his desk citing erratic behavior. Even his partner, young Constable Saito, started keeping his distance, afraid, no doubt, of being dragged down with a man marked for professional ruin. Joel had seen it all before. a slow squeeze, not through bullets but bureaucracy. But this time, he was ready. He kept duplicates of everything: photos, reports, audio recordings of conversations in the police canteen. Most importantly, he had a list, 15 names scrawled on the back of a boarding pass. Names of shipping clerks, port security contractors, and one high-level procurement officer in the Ministry of Commerce. All linked, directly or through family, to a shell company in Quelimane that controlled 3 warehouses and a freight corridor running inland. It was the freight corridor that mattered. Joel followed it like a vein, starting in Nacala and driving hours inland in an unmarked car he borrowed from his cousin. He stopped at roadside bars, spoke to truckers, paid for too many beers and too little information. But he gathered enough. Trucks labeled as carrying grain or textiles were often seen late at night, moving in convoys with military-style escorts. When he followed one from a distance, he noticed a disturbing detail. None of the trucks stopped at police checkpoints. In fact, the police waved them through every time. On a hunch, he drove further inland to an old airstrip outside Guru, long abandoned after the war. It was there he found the hangar, guarded by armed men with radios and foreign tattoos. Through binoculars, he watched them unload sealed crates from the trucks, only to reload them into 2 small cargo planes. He took pictures, enough to raise questions, enough to get him killed. That night, he returned to Nampula and backed up his files onto a pair of encrypted USB drives. One, he mailed to a friend in Maputo, an NGO lawyer who specialized in anti-corruption cases. The other, he hid inside a hollowed-out Bible in his late father's home. He knew they'd come. The next morning, he found his apartment ransacked. Nothing taken, just shredded papers, broken dishes, and a single chilling message scrawled in red across his wall. Tiona Kawiri, we see you again. It was Chichewa, Malawian, a confirmation of everything he feared. He fled the city that night, riding the back of a tomato truck toward Ngosh, where he hoped to hide among the fishing communities until he could reach out to his contact. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, he saw something in the rearview mirror of the truck's cabin. A white SUV, no license plate, keeping pace far too smoothly. His driver noticed too, and muttered something in Makua, before turning off the main road into the bush. They rode for 10 minutes, then heard the SUV peel off in another direction. Joel thanked the driver and slipped out, deciding to walk the rest of the way under moonlight. When he arrived at Ngosh, it was nearly midnight, and the waves of the Indian Ocean sounded to him like whispers of the dead. He didn't sleep. He sat by the beach, breathing in salt, staring out into the dark water, knowing that the war he had uncovered was bigger than anything he could stop alone. But it no longer mattered. Truth, once revealed, was like fire, unpredictable, dangerous, and impossible to contain. By the time the sun rose, painting the sky above Ngosh in bruised oranges and indifferent pinks, Joel Simango had made his decision. He couldn't run anymore, not with what he knew, not with what he carried. The flash drive in his pocket was no longer just evidence. It was leverage, maybe the only kind that mattered in a country slowly choking on silence. He watched fishermen pulling in their nets with heavy eyes, the same nets he'd seen before filled not with sardines or mackerel, but with corpses, and he realized that the ocean had become the city's graveyard. How many secrets lay buried in its depths? How many mothers still searched for children who'd vanished between the cracks of shipping manifests and forged customs papers? He knew the only way forward was to go loud, make the story bigger than they could contain. And for that, he needed someone louder than him. Someone untouchable. He reached out to Sofia Ramirez, a Portuguese journalist with Alerta Lusofona, who had once been blacklisted from Angola for exposing a fuel smuggling ring involving generals and French intermediaries. He used a burner phone purchased from a street vendor, typed out a single message in Portuguese. Tenho nomes. Tenho imigans. Encounter-me. JS. Then he waited, hiding in the alley behind a closed market, surrounded by crates of drying cassava and the hum of distant radio static. Within hours, Sophia replied. She was already in Nampula, digging into reports of disappearances along the northern coast, and Joel's message hit her like a fuse. They arranged to meet that night in a beachside chapel long since abandoned, one of those old Catholic missions that the jungle had nearly reclaimed, vines coiling around wooden beams, stained glass faded and broken. She arrived just before midnight, alone, dressed in cargo pants and a windbreaker, carrying 2 cameras, 3 batteries, and a notepad stuffed with questions. Joel didn't speak at first. He just handed her the USB and a printed dossier of names, maps, shipment logs, and annotated photos taken through his binoculars. Sophia said nothing for a long time. Her fingers trembled as she flipped through page after page of horror, cloaked in the cold language of logistics. When she finally looked up, her voice was hoarse. "Do you understand what this is?" she asked. "It's not just trafficking. This is a network. Multinational. Funded. Protected." Joel nodded. "I know. And I think it's bigger than Mozambique." They spent 3 hours going over every detail. Sophia recorded his voice on a mini recorder, her questions sharp and surgical. Joel told her about the truck convoys, the hidden hangar, the compromised officials. He mentioned the foreign men, Russians, Lebanese, South Africans, who floated through the port areas like ghosts, never registering on immigration logs, but always pulling strings behind layers of shell corporations. He gave her everything, and still, he knew it wasn't enough. What he had was only one limb of the beast. But with Sophia's reach, it might be the first wound deep enough to make it bleed. They agreed on a plan. Sophia would leave Mozambique within 24 hours and publish a preliminary exposé through her network, with names redacted and evidence blurred just enough to protect sources. Joel, meanwhile, would stay under the radar and wait for the fallout. If the article got traction, the people watching him might retreat, at least temporarily. But neither of them truly believed in safety. As they parted ways outside the chapel, Sophia gave him a long look and said, "They'll come for you anyway. You know that, right?" Joel smiled, tired and dry. "Let them. I've got nothing left they can take." But the machine worked faster than he expected. By morning, the government declared an internal terrorist alert based on alleged threats to Mozambique's economic corridors. Security forces swept through ports in Nacala and Beira, arresting foreign agitators, though no names were ever released. The Ministry of Interior announced the discovery of a sabotage network targeting national commerce. It was classic damage control: burn the pawns, lock the gates, blame it all on external enemies. But Joel wasn't fooled. Neither was Sophia. The real architects remained untouched, layers deep, sipping imported whiskey in villas shielded by military police. Still, her article hit the airwaves 2 days later, and it spread like wildfire. Blood routes, the hidden trade flowing through Mozambique's veins. It featured pixelated images of the hangar, redacted interview snippets, and a blurry still of the white SUV trailing a tomato truck. No one was named, but the message was clear. Someone had pulled back the curtain. Reactions were swift. The ruling party condemned the article as foreign misinformation. State TV denounced Sophia as a paid saboteur. But behind the curtain, things moved. Quiet resignations, abrupt transfers, murmurs in the back rooms of Parliament. International NGOs called for investigations. Embassies sent cryptic cables. Something had been stirred. For Joel, that meant movement. He left Ngaush that night under the cover of a thunderstorm, traveling inland on foot with a fisherman's son who owed him a favor. They reached Nakaroa by dawn, and from there Joel slipped onto an aid convoy headed west. Every face was a possible threat. Every checkpoint, a potential execution. But he kept moving, disappearing into Mozambique's vast, crumbling interior, where dirt roads ran like veins and power was still local. Weeks passed. The world forgot. Headlines shifted to elections, scandals in Brazil, oil in Nigeria. Sophia went silent after the second article, likely under pressure or worse. Joel didn't know if she made it out. He didn't ask. He became a myth, a name whispered among activists and junior officers. Some said he fled to Malawi. Others swore he'd died. But in truth, he stayed close, hiding in plain sight under a different name, tending goats for an old widow in a village too poor to matter. But he watched, and he waited, because stories like his don't end. They fester. Let's jump to next story. Story 5. Echoes of Coal. Tet Province, Mozambique, 2017. The soot hung thick in the morning air, caught between the smoky clouds billowing over Motai's coal mines and the sharp stench of oil from idling trucks that lined the edge of the highway like bloated, sleeping beasts. It was a place where heat clung to the skin like sin, where fortunes were whispered in the rhythm of excavators, and where men disappeared between the seams of official paperwork. They said the coal under the ground here could fuel nations, that the foreign investors who came from India, Brazil, and China were laying the foundations of progress. But everyone who lived along the Zambezi River knew better. They had seen too many men arrive with clean shirts and foreign passports, only to vanish in a sea of bribes, concrete, and night. João Mendes was one of those men. though he wasn't here to vanish. He had come back to Mozambique after 6 years in Johannesburg's underworld, dragging behind him a past soaked in blood and silence. He had come to Tet with a job to finish, and a name to bury. It started with a man called Albino Chisano, a former police officer turned logistics broker who had found himself at the intersection of smuggling routes between Zimbabwe and Malawi, orchestrating shadow convoys that moved weapons, minerals, and bodies under the cover of legitimate cargo manifests. Albino's mistake wasn't the business. Everyone in Tet had their hands dirty, but arrogance. He'd tried to skim from the wrong client, a Brazilian subcontractor with ties to one of the global mining giants. João had warned him, subtly, carefully, through a message passed along with a shipment of canned mackerel. But Albino didn't listen, and 3 weeks later, his charred remains were found in a drainage ditch behind a decommissioned plant. Officially, the case was ruled an accident, an electrical fire caused by faulty equipment. Unofficially, no one cared. But João cared, not because he had loved Albino, or even liked him, but because the death had been public. Loud, uncontrolled. Someone had broken the code of invisibility, and that meant everything was about to change. João's return to Mozambique was not just about loyalty, it was about debt. He owed a man named Elias Nguenha, once a powerful figure in the anti-poaching task force, now the invisible architect behind much of the illicit transport running through Tet province. Elias had been quiet for years, hiding behind the mining boom's noise, slipping between legal contracts and NGO handshakes, but the recent influx of foreign capital had changed the ecosystem. With every mine that opened, more foreign eyes arrived, and Elias needed someone who could navigate that murky in-between, someone who could manage risk and eliminate variables. João was that someone, a fixer, fluent in multiple dialects, capable of disappearing as easily as he appeared, and comfortable with death. Elias summoned him not with words, but with an envelope left at a hotel reception in Camoyo, a name, a date, and a photo of a young woman with a laptop bag slung across her shoulder. Her name was Esperança Vilanculos, an IT analyst employed by a South African consulting firm contracted to perform digital audits on mining output. She was smart, thorough, and dangerously naive. According to Elias's informants, she had uncovered a pattern of false data, numbers that didn't match the actual shipments leaving the mines. Even worse, she had begun asking questions about the ghost shipments, the containers that were logged but never inspected. João's job was simple: intercept her findings, determine if she had backups, and neutralize the threat. The last part could be done quietly or messily. João preferred quiet. Less paperwork, fewer eyes. But as he trailed Esperança over the course of 4 days, from her guest house to her office, to her frequent visits to a local church where she helped teach evening literacy classes, he began to suspect she wasn't as naive as the reports claimed. She changed her routes often, never stayed out past sunset, and used different taxis every time she traveled between towns. On the 3rd night, João saw her hand off a flash drive to a man outside the church, a British humanitarian who worked in local water development. That was the crack. That was how it spread. João followed the Brit, tailing him through the broken streets of Tet, waiting until he ducked into a side alley to smoke. The man never saw the blow that broke his larynx or felt the second that crushed his skull. João searched his pockets but found nothing. The flash drive was gone. Either Esperança had given him a decoy, or he had already passed it to someone else. João didn't like either possibility. He returned to his hotel that night, stripped off his dusty shirt, and stared at his reflection in the cracked mirror. He was getting slower, maybe even softer. By morning, the city was humming with rumors. The humanitarian's death had not gone unnoticed. He was scheduled to give a presentation at a regional development summit, and his absence triggered immediate alarm. Police checkpoints began appearing, staffed by underpaid officers with twitchy fingers and too many questions. João knew he had a window, maybe 2 days, before everything collapsed. He met Elias in a soundproofed room behind a tavern on the outskirts of town, the smell of stale beer and gun oil thick in the air. Elias looked older, his once black beard streaked with gray, but his eyes were still sharp. "You're slipping," he said, without preamble. "The girl's still alive, and now we have an international death on our hands." João said nothing for a long moment, then replied, "She gave the data to someone. Possibly a network. I can't trace it until I know who she trusts." Elias exhaled through his nose. "You have 1 night. After that, she's not your problem anymore." The meaning was clear. Another team would handle it, and they wouldn't be careful. That night, Joao waited outside the church again. Esperanza arrived early, carrying a satchel and walking with a nervous rhythm. She knew. She had to. He watched as she entered the building, then waited. 30 minutes passed. Then finally, Joao stepped inside, into the warm flicker of candlelight and the scent of old wood and incense. She was already waiting for him in the back pew. "I know who you are," she said, without turning around, "and I know what you were sent to do." Joao didn't deny it. "Then why haven't you done it?" she asked. Because something had changed. Because she reminded him of someone he had lost. Because maybe this time, it didn't have to end with a bullet. But Joao couldn't say that. So he said nothing. Just sat down beside her, in the shadows of stained glass and impossible choices. Silence sat heavily between them in the old church, broken only by the low murmur of prayer drifting from the front pews and the distant hiss of tires outside, cutting through Tet's red dust like razors. Esperanza kept her eyes ahead, fixed on the altar, her expression unreadable. Joao studied her, the set of her jaw, the subtle tremor in her hands. She was afraid, but not in the way most were. This wasn't the fear of pain or death, it was the fear of being too late, of not getting the truth out in time. Joao had seen that look before years ago, in the face of a journalist in Cape Town who thought her voice could stand up to oil money and syndicate guns. She ended up in the bay, her lungs filled with salt and regret. But Esperanza was different. She wasn't suicidal. She was calculating. She knew he'd followed her. She knew she was a target, and yet she'd waited for him. "I gave the real data to someone who's already gone," she said at last, her voice low but steady. "To Nairobi. If anything happens to me, it goes public. Emails, audit logs, shipment tracking, bribes, all of it." She turned to face him now, her eyes hard. "So if you came to kill me, it's already too late." Joao leaned back against the pew, staring up at the stained glass depiction of St. Anthony above them, his arms outstretched as though offering peace neither of them could afford. He didn't answer right away. There was a strange calm spreading in his chest, something unfamiliar. Maybe it was respect, maybe fatigue, or maybe the weight of knowing that the machine he worked for, the one that had turned Mozambican soil into a ledger of extractive violence, was about to crack under the pressure of a woman who refused to disappear. Elias would not forgive this. If the data went public, heads would roll, high-profile heads with diplomatic passports and security firms on retainer. The mining contracts were supposed to be ironclad, but Joao also knew something Elias didn't. The people in Nairobi didn't just want exposure. They wanted leverage. "Who are you really working with?" he asked quietly. Esperanza hesitated. Then, "Does it matter? It's bigger than me. Bigger than you." He smiled without humor. "Everything's bigger than us. Until someone puts a bullet in the wrong skull and it all burns." She looked at him for a long moment, then said, "I don't think you want to kill me. I'm not here for what I want." That was the end of it. Joao rose and left, stepping back into the evening's sweltering haze, the sky turning orange behind a veil of smoke. As he walked past the checkpoint on Rua Forte Outubro, the young officer standing guard barely glanced at his forged credentials. Joao's mind was already working through possibilities. Killing Esperanza would stop nothing now. Nairobi was in motion. But maybe, just maybe, there was another way, something between survival and damnation. Back at the hotel, his burner phone buzzed. A single text from Elias. "Your time is up." There was no signature, no threat. But Joao understood. They'd be sending someone else now. Probably more than one. And they wouldn't ask questions. They'd take Esperanza, drag her into a truck, and stage a robbery gone wrong, or an accident, or maybe they'd pin it on one of the rebel groups still hiding in Sofala. Either way, it would end the same, silence. But Joao had made a decision somewhere between the church pew and that text. He called in an old favor, the kind that carried decades of quiet violence behind it. The line rang once, then connected. "I need to get someone out," he said. "Tonight." There was a pause. Then, name, location, passport? Joao rattled it off. A fake passport under the name Carla Nasengo, registered under a defunct NGO. She'd be on the manifest of a humanitarian flight heading to Nampula at 3 a.m., with an onward leg to Dar es Salaam. From there, Nairobi. It was risky, but it was possible. He met Esperanza at the back of the university library, in a disused records room that smelled of mildew and forgotten ink. She was already packing a laptop and 2 thumb drives into a canvas bag. "You're not going to try to stop me? I'm giving you 3 hours. After that, You're someone else's problem. She studied him carefully. Why? I don't know, Joao said. Maybe I want to see what happens when someone actually pulls the trigger on the truth. She nodded. No thanks. No dramatics. Just the unspoken understanding that the clock had started ticking, and each second could be the difference between escape and a shallow grave. They moved fast. Joao knew the city's blind spots, the intersections where CCTV never worked, the patrol routes with the most gaps. He drove an old Nissan borrowed from a local funeral home, low profile, unregistered. At 2:50 a.m., they arrived at the airstrip outside the city. A plane was already waiting on the tarmac, the roar of its propellers masking any final doubts. Before she boarded, Esperanza turned to him. They'll come after you. He shrugged. They already are. What will you do? Joao looked out across the tarmac, toward the faint line of the Zambezi beyond. I'll stay ahead of them. Long enough, at least. Then she was gone, swallowed by the plane's metal belly, and Joao stood there, alone, the night pressing in. He knew Elias wouldn't let this go. But he also knew that some debts had to be paid in full. Maybe it was redemption. Maybe suicide. But either way, the story wasn't over. He lit a cigarette, watching the plane disappear into the horizon. It had begun. Silence sat heavily between them in the old church, broken only by the low murmur of prayer drifting from the front pews and the distant hiss of tires outside, cutting through Tet's red dust like razors. Esperanza kept her eyes ahead, fixed on the altar, her expression unreadable. Joao studied her, the set of her jaw, the subtle tremor in her hands. She was afraid, but not in the way most were. This wasn't the fear of pain or death. It was the fear of being too late, of not getting the truth out in time. Joao had seen that look before, years ago, in the face of a journalist in Cape Town who thought her voice could stand up to oil money and syndicate guns. She ended up in the bay, her lungs filled with salt and regret. But Esperanza was different. She wasn't suicidal. She was calculating. She knew he'd followed her. She knew she was a target. And yet, she'd waited for him. I gave the real data to someone who's already gone, she said at last, her voice low but steady. To Nairobi. If anything happens to me, it goes public. Emails, audit logs, shipment tracking, bribes, all of it. She turned to face him now, her eyes hard. So if you came to kill me, it's already too late. Joao leaned back against the pew, staring up at the stained glass depiction of St. Anthony above them, his arms outstretched as though offering peace neither of them could afford. He didn't answer right away. There was a strange calm spreading in his chest, something unfamiliar. Maybe it was respect, maybe fatigue, or maybe the weight of knowing that the machine he worked for, the one that had turned Mozambican soil into a ledger of extractive violence, was about to crack under the pressure of a woman who refused to disappear. Elias would not forgive this. If the data went public, heads would roll, high-profile heads with diplomatic passports and security firms on retainer. The mining contracts were supposed to be ironclad, but Joao also knew something Elias didn't. The people in Nairobi didn't just want exposure. They wanted leverage. Who are you really working with? He asked quietly. Esperanza hesitated. Then, does it matter? It's bigger than me. Bigger than you. He smiled without humor. Everything's bigger than us. Until someone puts a bullet in the wrong skull, and it all burns. She looked at him for a long moment, then said, I don't think you want to kill me. I'm not here for what I want. That was the end of it. Joao rose and left, stepping back into the evening's sweltering haze, the sky turning orange behind a veil of smoke. As he walked past the checkpoint on Rua 4 de Outubro, the young officer standing guard barely glanced at his forged credentials. Joao's mind was already working through possibilities. Killing Esperanza would stop nothing now. Nairobi was in motion. But maybe, just maybe, there was another way, something between survival and damnation. Back at the hotel, his burner phone buzzed. A single text from Elias. Your time is up. There was no signature, no threat. But Joao understood. They'd be sending someone else now. Probably more than one. And they wouldn't ask questions. They'd take Esperanza, drag her into a truck, and stage a robbery gone wrong, or an accident, or maybe they'd pin it on one of the rebel groups still hiding in Sofala. Either way, it would end the same, silence. But Joao had made a decision somewhere between the church pew and that text. He called in an old favor, the kind that carried decades of quiet violence behind it. The line rang once, then connected. I need to get someone out, he said. Tonight. There was a pause. Then, name, location, passport? Joao rattled it off. A fake passport under the name Carla Nasengo, registered under a defunct NGO. She'd be on the manifest of a humanitarian flight heading to Nampula at 3 a.m. with an onward leg to Dar es Salaam. From there, Nairobi. It was risky, but it was possible. He met Esperanza at the back of the university library, in a disused records room that smelled of mildew and forgotten ink. She was already packing a laptop and 2 thumb drives into a canvas bag. "You're not going to try to stop me? I'm giving you 3 hours. After that, you're someone else's problem." She studied him carefully. "Why?" "I don't know," Joao said. "Maybe I want to see what happens when someone actually pulls the trigger on the truth." She nodded. "No thanks. No dramatics. Just the unspoken understanding that the clock had started ticking, and each second could be the difference between escape and a shallow grave." They moved fast. Joao knew the city's blind spots, the intersections where CCTV never worked, the patrol routes with the most gaps. He drove an old Nissan borrowed from a local funeral home, low profile, unregistered. At 2:50 a.m., they arrived at the airstrip outside the city. A plane was already waiting on the tarmac, the roar of its propellers masking any final doubts. Before she boarded, Esperanza turned to him. "They'll come after you." He shrugged. "They already are." "What will you do?" Joao looked out across the tarmac, toward the faint line of the Zambezi beyond. "I'll stay ahead of them. Long enough, at least." Then she was gone, swallowed by the plane's metal belly, and Joao stood there, alone, the night pressing in. He knew Elias wouldn't let this go. But he also knew that some debts had to be paid in full. Maybe it was redemption. Maybe suicide. But either way, the story wasn't over. He lit a cigarette, watching the plane disappear into the horizon. It had begun. By dawn, the air in Tet had already thickened with the acrid tang of coal dust, and Joao found himself staring into a cracked bathroom mirror in the derelict flat above Café Zambeze. His hands were wet, not from washing, but from the tremble of adrenaline he hadn't shaken since Esperanza's plane vanished into the east. Beneath the mirror's frame, tucked into the splintered plaster, was a micro-SD card, a contingency plan he had never planned to use, but always carried like a shard of insurance. It held contracts, photos, surveillance screenshots, and one grainy video of a man who no longer existed signing away an entire valley to Elias's shell company. Joao hadn't wanted to become a whistleblower. He had simply wanted to disappear before the reckoning. But something in Esperanza's final look, the calm with which she walked toward death or daylight, had changed his equation. Maybe there was no running from this anymore. Maybe the only way out was through the fire. He didn't go underground, not right away. That would be too obvious. Instead, he returned to the city in broad daylight, walked through the cacophony of street vendors and honking minibuses, and sat at the open-air stall of an old friend named Tomas, who grilled goat skewers and spoke in code. "You look like you slept on bullets," Tomas said, sliding him a plate without asking. "I might have," Joao replied, accepting the meat with fingers that shook only slightly. "I need to get to Beira." Quietly. Tomas didn't blink. "The port?" Joao nodded once. Beira was where the true shadow networks pulsed, in containers mislabeled with Purdue stickers, in the fuel tankers filled with arms instead of diesel, in the customs office ruled by bribes instead of stamps. If Joao could get there, he could vanish into one of the last shipping lanes untouched by digital tracking. Or, failing that, he could find someone with the reach to bargain with Elias directly. He didn't expect mercy, but maybe there was leverage enough for an exchange. Tomas arranged the ride, a dented flatbed truck filled with sacks of maize bound for a storage depot outside the coast. Joao hid beneath the sacks, breathing in mold and dust for 10 straight hours, the heat unbearable, the weight agonizing. At one point they were stopped by a group of drunk soldiers waving outdated rifles, and he thought it was over. But the driver, stone-faced, unflinching, slipped them 2 green bills and kept moving. When Joao emerged near Beira, covered in grime and blood from where the sacks had cut into his arms, he felt less like a man and more like a ghost retracing the footprints of the living. The port city was worse than he remembered. The flooding from 2 years prior had never been properly repaired, and the streets stank of sewage and salt. People walked like shadows, eyes down, skin worn thin by poverty and corruption. But Joao didn't need the city's face. He needed its lungs, its backrooms, its alleys. He found them in the basement of a shuttered fish market, where an old contact named Reynaldo now ran a smuggling ring under the guise of a cold storage service. The man greeted Joao with suspicion, but not surprise. In this line of work, old ghosts always returned eventually. "What did you bring me?" Reynaldo asked, examining the microSD card beneath a desk lamp. Enough to buy myself 36 hours, Joao said. Maybe 48. Reynaldo inserted the card into a cracked laptop and watched as line after line of data filled the screen. Coordinates, emails, bribery spreadsheets. His brows lifted. You're insane. Probably. You know what happens if I so much as forward this to the wrong inbox? Joao didn't answer. He didn't need to. Reynaldo sighed, rubbed his temples, then poured 2 shots of cane liquor. There's a freighter leaving tomorrow night. Outbound to Mombasa. After that, Colombo. It doesn't dock long enough for inspection, but you'll be buried between crates of machine parts. No papers, no trace. That's enough. But not forever. I know. They clinked glasses. The drink burned like betrayal, but Joao welcomed it. By midnight, the port was humming with activity. Cranes moaning over rusted hulls, workers shouting in 5 languages, the entire coastline lit like an oil fire. Joao kept his head low, his duffel pressed close. The manifest said nothing about a passenger. If Elias's men were watching the docks, he'd be dead before reaching the gangplank. But luck, for once, seemed to hold. That was until he saw the child. A girl, no older than 7, barefoot and covered in grime, standing alone between 2 shipping containers near the security checkpoint. She looked at him, not past him, and pointed. Joao froze. At first, he thought she was gesturing at something behind him, but then he saw the red dot on her chest. A laser. A warning. He spun just as the bullet struck the container beside him. Silence shattered. Then shouts. Joao Dove rolled, ducked between crates, his breath ragged. Another shot cracked overhead. Elias's men. They'd found him. Or they'd never stopped watching. He ran, zigzagging, knowing the layout of the port better than most of its workers. A narrow service tunnel led toward the water's edge. He took it, emerging behind the customs warehouse. Blood ran from a gash in his side. He didn't remember being hit. He didn't stop. He didn't even look back. At the dock, the freighter's engine was already churning. A single rope bridge connected it to the concrete. Joao sprinted. A shot rang out. His leg buckled, but he threw himself forward, landing hard against the hull's edge, gripping metal with every last thread of strength he had left. A sailor pulled him up, swearing in Swahili. The ramp was pulled. The ship moved. As Bera's lights faded behind him, Joao collapsed in the hold, chest heaving, fingers still clutching the SD card as if it were a talisman. He didn't know if he'd live long enough to reach Nairobi. He didn't know if Esperanca was safe. But the truth had been carried. The damage was done. Somewhere in the dark, the machine that had consumed Mozambique's riches and left its people in the dust would begin to bleed. And Joao, wounded and anonymous, would become what the system feared most, a ghost with nothing left to lose. Let's jump to next story. Story 6. Ashes in Cabo Delgado. The smell of burnt rubber and scorched iron still lingered in the air long after the sun dipped below the flat, desolate skyline of Mocimboa de Praia. It was a town once filled with fishermen and children playing barefoot in the sand, now turned into a crucible of blood and silence, where the only thing louder than the gunfire was the fear buried in every citizen's chest. In the shadow of Mozambique's forgotten north, the insurgency had cracked open more than government outposts. It had split loyalties, unleashed ghosts, and turned profit into peril. Somewhere amid the wreckage of war and cartel whispers, a man named Afonso Tavares carved a living. Not out of honesty, not out of loyalty, but out of cunning. He was a fixer, a broker, a parasite, or a savior depending on who paid first. And on a sweltering April evening, seated at a rusting shipping container repurposed into an office with one flickering light bulb and a fan that hadn't worked since December, he accepted the most dangerous job of his life with a shrug and a half-smile. The man across from him was called Elias Matola, though he rarely introduced himself with anything other than a number. His reputation preceded him like heat before a wildfire. Ex-intelligence, now freelance operator for whoever had enough medicais or diamonds to make his silence permanent. His left hand was wrapped in cloth, blood already drying into the fibers. He placed a battered sat phone and a manila folder on the desk, pushing them toward Afonso without ceremony. The target is embedded with Total's field crew, gas logistics, a fungi site, he said, his voice like gravel and whiskey. French passport. Real name's not important. What matters is she's collecting more than seismic data. Afonso raised an eyebrow as he flipped open the folder. Inside was a grainy photograph of a woman in a high-visibility vest, sunglasses perched on her brow, crouched beside a fuel tank and holding a GPS device. There was something in her posture, controlled, calculated. Not a tourist. Not an environmentalist. Intelligence? Corporate spy? The details didn't matter yet, only the risk. Surveillance photos, maps of the compound, and a partial export manifest followed. Afonso whistled low, then leaned back in his creaking chair. "You want her removed or repurposed?" he asked. Elias didn't blink. "I want her intercepted, interrogated, and buried. Deep. She's sending out burst transmissions. We caught two. If she sends a third, someone will come looking, and we'll be the ones in the ground." Afonso nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of the order. The LNG projects in Cabo Delgado weren't just economic miracles on paper. They were battlegrounds dressed in suits. Every faction had a stake. Multinationals, government officials, insurgents, and mercenary companies all dancing in a deadly circle around profits buried deep beneath the seabed. A leak, especially to the outside world, could collapse the fragile ecosystem of silence and greed that kept the operation afloat. He understood. He also understood that if the woman really was transmitting data to a foreign agency, it wasn't just her life in danger. Anyone who touched this would become a liability, a name etched into someone else's kill list. But Afonso didn't believe in names, only numbers. And Elias had just offered a number with too many zeros to ignore. He took the job. The next 48 hours blurred into motion, arrangements, bribes, and false identities. Afonso activated two of his most trusted assets. Jamal, a former soldier with scars running like rivers across his back and a gift for silence, and Marta, a logistics specialist who posed as a field medic, but had once hacked an oil rig's internal comms to steal €3 million worth of transaction data. Together, they moved like whispers through the fractured coast, boarding a stolen fisheries vessel repurposed to dock at the periphery of a fungi security zone. The guards on rotation barely glanced at the forged credentials. Chaos had become so common that procedure was now ornamental. The insurgents had attacked 3 weeks earlier, dragging away 15 workers. Since then, the contractors, military-trained South Africans, mostly, were more focused on perimeter defense than background checks. Inside the camp, Afonso slipped into his alias as easily as a second skin. He was Dr. Mario Costa, logistics audit supervisor, with a clipboard and an oil-stained jumpsuit to match. For 2 days, he tracked the woman, observing her from shadows, mapping her habits, confirming she operated alone. She had a small satellite modem sewn into the lining of her vest, a clever trick. She worked near the compressor stations and pipeline junctions, always within 15 meters of a vantage point. Too careful, too quiet, definitely trained. On the third night, the opportunity opened. A thunderstorm rolled in from the east, snarling overhead like a beast trying to tear the sky in half. Lightning fractured the horizon, and the camp's electrical systems flickered, briefly blind. In the confusion, Afonso and Jamal slipped into the maintenance corridor that ran along the desalination outflow, intercepting her on her return from the tanks. She didn't scream. She fought, quick, calculated, even managing to jab a knife into Jamal's thigh before Marta's taser dropped her to the concrete with a dull thud. Afonso cursed as blood pooled near Jamal's boot, but time was currency, and they were already overdrawn. They dragged her to a storage unit near the north fence, where the signal interference was strongest. No one asked what they would do with her. They all knew. Elias had sent a location, coordinates just outside Palma, in a quarry that had been empty since the gas project rerouted. The message was clear: deliver the body, preferably in pieces. But things began to unravel quickly. As Marta examined the modem and prepped to destroy it, she found a second chip hidden beneath a seam. Encrypted, not broadcasting data, but receiving it. Afonso stared at it, heart slowing. Why would a spy receive transmissions on site? Who was talking to her? Then the radio cracked. A warning. Unidentified vehicle. 1 click from perimeter. Armed. No insignia. The storm hadn't scared them off. Someone had known. Someone had followed. The quarry outside Palma had once been alive with noise. Saws, drills, trucks moving limestone to build beachfront hotels that never reached completion. Now it was a graveyard of rusted machines and sun-bleached cranes, overgrown with thornbush and termite hills. That night, it became something else entirely, a war zone buried in silence. Afonso's convoy was already 30 minutes out from the camp when the first drone buzzed overhead like a mechanical insect, its tiny red light blinking in rhythm with the tension pounding through his chest. The woman in the back of the truck had regained consciousness only moments before. Her wrists were zip-tied, her mouth gagged, but her eyes gleamed with an eerie calm, as if she had never expected to survive and yet knew exactly how to die. Marta watched her in the rearview mirror while Jamal bled silently in the front passenger seat, pressing gauze to his thigh and mumbling prayers under his breath. Afonso had seen operations fall apart before, but not like this. This felt coordinated, precise, like something had gone wrong hours before they ever knew they were being played. Then the road exploded. The lead vehicle, a battered Hilux packed with diversion equipment and one of Elias's local scouts, disintegrated into a column of fire and shrapnel. Tires flew, metal rained onto the windshield, and the blast wave lifted their own truck off the ground for a split second before slamming it back onto the cracked road like a toy tossed by an angry god. Jamal's scream was lost in the cacophony, and the steering wheel bucked violently in Afonso's hands as he struggled to keep them from tipping over. Behind them, Marta had instinctively flung herself over the prisoner, shielding her body with her own. The air filled with smoke and dirt, blinding and suffocating. They had seconds to decide. Move! Move on foot! Afonso shouted, dragging Jamal from the passenger door, blood already soaking through the bandage and down his boot. Marta followed, pulling the woman with her, though the shock of the explosion had dazed her. Somewhere to the northwest, flashlights were bobbing in the darkness, men moving fast, trained. Whoever they were, they hadn't come for a quiet cleanup. They came for a retrieval. They ran into the bush, scrambling through dense undergrowth and dodging thorny branches that tore at their skin and clothes. The sound of footsteps, 6, maybe 7, pursued them relentlessly. Whoever these men were, they weren't insurgents. Insurgents made noise. These men were shadows, communicating with hand signals and flashes of infrared. That meant Western. Mercs maybe. Worse, maybe government. Jamal collapsed before they reached the quarry edge. His wound had reopened, the blood trail unmistakable. Afonso knew they couldn't carry him. He looked his old friend in the eye and said nothing. Jamal nodded once, drew his sidearm, and turned back toward the sounds. His last words, "I'll buy you time," were carried off by the wind. Then the shots began, measured, controlled bursts, until they stopped. A silence heavier than any scream. By the time they reached the quarry, Marta and Afonso were breathing in ragged gasps. The woman was half conscious again, her knees buckling with every step, but she never cried out. She simply stared at them with something like contempt or pity. Afonso had to stop himself from hitting her. The plan was ashes. The backup plan was suicide, and the only option left was improvisation. They hid beneath an abandoned loader at the quarry's southern wall, concealed beneath a mound of loose gravel. Marta wiped sweat from her brow and whispered, "She's not just intelligence. This is extraction. High value." Afonso nodded. "She's bait. Someone knew we'd grab her. They knew where we'd take her. Elias set this up." The implication turned Marta's face pale. If Elias had burned them, there would be no recovery. He had friends in every militia, oil company, and embassy from Pemba to Johannesburg. He didn't need a reason. He needed a lesson. Maybe the woman had been untouchable. Maybe Afonso had crossed a line he didn't know existed. Either way, they were no longer hunters. They were prey. Suddenly, a voice rang out through a megaphone, English, accented, maybe American. "You have something that doesn't belong to you. Release the asset. You won't be harmed." It was a lie, of course. Afonso had told the same lie before many times. He glanced at Marta, who looked down at the woman, now trembling, no longer smug. She didn't want to be recaptured. That much was clear. Whatever she was involved in, returning to her handlers scared her more than dying. Her eyes locked onto Afonso's, and for the first time, he saw desperation. "Help me disappear," she rasped through the gag, voice hoarse. "I'll pay you double what he did. There's a cache in Pemba. GPS in my boot. Proof. Money. Everything." Afonso's mind raced. It could be a trap, or a way out. Then Marta said, "I believe her. Elias used us. If they find us, they won't just kill us, they'll erase us." Afonso closed his eyes for a moment, calculating. The quarry had a drainage tunnel that led to a nearby ravine. If they made it there undetected, they could slip west and vanish into the jungle before dawn. But to do that, they had to move now. And if the soldiers were watching the perimeter, they had to cause a distraction. Afonso pulled out a flare, cracked it, and hurled it in the opposite direction. The red light soared across the quarry like a comet, landing near the loader wrecks. Almost immediately, Shouts echoed through the darkness, and footsteps shifted toward the flame. They had minutes. He grabbed the woman by the arm, motioned to Marta, and together they ducked into the drainage tunnel, half flooded, smelling of mildew and old oil. Behind them, gunfire erupted again. They didn't look back. By the time they emerged into the jungle basin, dawn was bleeding into the sky. The woman was still alive. Jamal wasn't. Elias had vanished. And Mozambique, in the chaos of insurgency and profit, would soon forget 3 more ghosts. But Afonso wouldn't forget, because in her boot, nestled beneath dirt and stitching, wasn't just a GPS. It was a memory card, and on it, something that could unravel everything. Let's jump to next story. Story 7. Frozen Ashes. Riga, Latvia, winter 2013. Snow fell silently over the Daugava River like a shroud of powdered glass, the kind of cold that made Riga forget how to breathe. On the west side of the river, just beyond the old Art Nouveau facades and tourist-packed cafes, the city grew darker, quieter, and meaner. That's where Victor Dremani's made his living, not with a badge or a business license, but with silence, shadow, and the occasional bullet. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, Victor had already broken 2 fingers and shattered 1 kneecap. His own handiwork, not for sport but information. The man's name was Loris Sills, a minor accountant with major secrets, the kind that could make someone very rich or very dead in the wrong hands. The problem wasn't whether Loris had talked. It was how much, and to whom. Victor stood in the middle of a warehouse near Moscava's forestate. The Jewish quarter before the war turned it into a graveyard of memory and soot. The building smelled of mold and iron filings. The walls sweated with moisture, and the concrete floor was stained with something darker than rust. Loris was still alive, barely, slumped in a chair with rope biting into his arms, his breath fogging in short, pitiful bursts. He'd admitted moving flash drives for a client in Brussels, a man who paid in anonymous crypto and knew more about Latvian customs patrols than any border agent should. But Loris didn't know the man's real name. He called himself Janus, he'd croaked, but everyone calls him the architect. Victor had heard that name before, in whispers, in encrypted forums, in the kind of messages that delete themselves before you can blink. That name didn't belong to a person. It belonged to a problem. The architect was behind the laundering of stolen digital securities. Millions in crypto funneled through shell companies using dormant industrial accounts in the Baltics, with Latvia serving as both a middleman and a firewall. Rumors said the architect operated like a ghost, never staying in the same city more than a few days, employing disposable crews to move intel and assets before torching the trail behind him, sometimes literally. Loris had been stupid enough to think he could skim off the top. That's why Victor had been hired, not just to punish, but to trace. And now he had a lead, however thin. A woman, Loris said before losing consciousness. Red hair. Tall. She handled pickups. Wore gloves always. Never spoke Latvian. She had an accent, maybe Russian, maybe Polish, and a tattoo on her wrist, 3 vertical lines. Victor didn't say it aloud, but he recognized the mark. Bratva. Not Russian anymore, but diaspora, an exiled faction operating independently of Moscow's hand. That complicated things. Victor left the warehouse in silence, his boots crunching over snow and salt. He didn't call it in. Not yet. He needed confirmation. He needed leverage. The client, an anonymous banker who called himself Juris, over Signal, wanted proof before paying the second half of the retainer. That was the game in Riga. Even murder needed a receipt. So Victor drove east into the Soviet-era sprawl of pervsiums, past monolithic housing blocks and flickering sodium lights. He knew where to find her, the red-haired woman. Not by name, not by address, but by behavior. People like her didn't vanish. They repeated themselves. Same bars. Same dead zones. Same shadows. He parked outside a brutalist apartment building and lit a cigarette, watching as patrons stumbled out of a late-night karaoke bar next door. At 2:11 a.m., she appeared. She wore a black wool coat with silver buttons and didn't slip on the ice. Her gloves were leather, her eyes calculating. She paused briefly beneath a street lamp, checked her reflection in a dirty bus stop mirror, and kept walking. That's when Victor moved. He didn't follow close, too easy to notice in this part of town. He kept half a block behind, watching her stride carry her not toward home, but deeper into the city's underbelly. She crossed over to the abandoned radio station on Gertrude's Isla, the one burned out in '97 and rumored to host drug deals and disappearances. She paused, glanced around, then slipped inside through a side entrance. Victor followed 30 seconds later. The building stank of rot and smoke. Broken equipment lay in heaps. Mold crawled up the walls like ivy. He found her in the basement, speaking softly into a satellite phone. Unaware, he was already aiming at her head from the shadows. But what froze Victor wasn't her presence. It was what she was looking at. On the floor, surrounded by cables and hard drives, was a steel suitcase half opened, revealing 5 passports, stacks of euros, and a small vial with Cyrillic markings and a yellow biohazard symbol. The woman ended her call. She turned slowly, her eyes meeting his, and smiled like she'd been waiting for him all night. "You're late," she said in unaccented English. Victor didn't lower his gun. "Who are you?" "You already know." "Bratva?" "Something older. Something freer." They stood like that for a long moment, the wind howling through broken windows above, the city oblivious to whatever conspiracy lay beneath its streets. Then she reached into her coat slowly, and Victor tensed, but she only pulled out a memory stick. "Give this to Juris," she said. "Tell him Riga is compromised. And tell him if he sends another hunter, I won't be so kind." "What's on it?" "Names. Yours might be on there soon if you're not careful." She vanished into the corridor like smoke, and Victor didn't follow. He looked down at the suitcase, at the passports, the cash, and the biohazard vial. And for the first time in years, he felt fear. Not of her, of what was coming. The USB drive was unmarked, but it weighed heavy in Victor's coat pocket as he walked back through the frozen streets, his breath forming ghosts in the moonlight. Every instinct he had told him to toss it in the river, to let the current carry it into oblivion where it couldn't ruin anyone else's life. But instincts were for men who could afford mistakes. Victor wasn't one of them. He drove to his flat in Agenskalns, an anonymous concrete box among hundreds, where his neighbors minded their own business and the power only flickered during snowstorms. He booted up a secure laptop he hadn't touched in months, cold as the grave, unconnected to anything wireless. He slid the USB in. It didn't auto-run. That was good. Inside, there were 3 folders. The first was titled Shima, Latvian for scheme. The second was Vardi, names. The third, Architages. He opened the folder of names first. It wasn't a list. It was a spreadsheet, encoded in a way that reminded him of bank software. Initials, transaction tags, routing numbers, aliases. But what jumped out was the embedded metadata. A patch of logs indicating synchronization with servers in Luxembourg, Nigeria, and a facility in Khabarovsk, Russia. Dozens of accounts, some clearly dead drops, others tied to diplomatic back channels. And then in line 117 was a name he recognized, Arvis Kaunens, a former state prosecutor, officially retired, rumored to have committed suicide in 2009. Victor had been at his funeral. He opened Shima next. It contained PDFs, satellite maps, and logistics diagrams, shipment routes through the port of Ventspils, military-grade chemical manifests disguised as agricultural transport, and phone records showing contacts between shell companies and diplomatic couriers. It was damning, industrial, and expansive. It wasn't just a money-laundering operation. It was a multinational covert pipeline for trafficking controlled materials, including narcotics and, judging by the records, possible weaponized pathogens. And Latvia, either knowingly or through willful blindness, had become the Baltic linchpin for the entire operation. The documents traced one figure through all of it, a middleman identified only by the codename Architages. His fingerprint was everywhere, from staging logistics to silencing whistleblowers. And then Victor realized why the third folder was named after him. Inside it, there were photos, dozens of them, some taken through windows, others from public surveillance feeds, all of Victor, walking, driving, at Lori's warehouse, talking to Juris. There were transcripts of calls that had never been recorded by any agency Victor knew. Someone had been tracking him long before he started this job, before Juris ever contacted him. This wasn't just a mission gone sideways. This was a net, and he had stepped directly into it. A final image caught his eye, a blurry black and white shot of his younger sister, Inez, taken from the side of a hospital in Liepāja, where she worked as a trauma nurse. A timestamp from 3 days ago. That wasn't just surveillance. That was a warning. The burn of panic hit the base of Victor's throat, but he didn't let it surface. Panic was useless now. He shut the laptop, pulled the drive, and crushed it beneath his boot. He needed to disappear, at least until he understood the rules of this new game. He called Juris from a burner in a stairwell that smelled of wet brick and tobacco. "I've got something," he said, voice flat. "It's bigger than we thought. You have the flash drive?" "I had it. You'll get what's on it if I live long enough." There was silence on the other end. Then, carefully, "They said you'd find her." "I did. She found me too. And she told me to warn you. Riga's compromised. She might be right. I'm flying in tomorrow." "No, don't. You won't make it past the airport." Another pause. Juris's voice, when it returned, was quieter. "What did you find, Victor?" "Your name's not on the list," Victor said, "but I can't tell if that's a relief or a threat." Juris didn't laugh. "Where will you go?" Victor ended the call without answering. Trust was a currency now, and he was broke. He packed in minutes, one duffel bag, cash, burner phones, a single Makarov pistol he'd never registered. He left the apartment key under the radiator and took the back stairs, never touching the front door. On the way out of the city, he stopped at a petrol station off the A10, bought a coffee, and left a message in the bathroom stall for an old contact named Dmitry's, code words Old Intel Habits. He needed eyes in Khabarovsk. He needed to know how deep this went, and if it tied back to his own past. By dawn, he was southbound in a stolen van with license plates he swapped at a truck stop. The woman from the warehouse, the Bratva ghost, had chosen not to kill him, but that didn't mean she was done with him. Maybe she needed him alive. Maybe she was sending him somewhere worse than death. What chilled Victor most was the feeling he couldn't shake. That she'd been testing him, watching whether he'd open the drive, whether he'd pass it on, or whether he'd fold and vanish. And now, by destroying it, he'd declared himself independent. But independence in this world had a price. As the miles unspooled beneath his tires and Latvia faded into a silver mist behind him, Victor knew there would be no home to return to. Riga was already burning, even if no one smelled the smoke yet. And soon, someone would come looking. Someone who didn't knock. Someone who didn't miss. Let's jump to next story. Story 8. Shadows over Riga. Latvia, 2010. The winter of 2010 clung to Riga like a secret, cold, bitter, and layered in silence. Snow had swallowed the sidewalks and roof lines, muting the old city's Baroque edges and Soviet scars. In the faint orange of sodium lamps, the snow took on a dull copper sheen, as though the city bled beneath its stillness. It was on one such freezing night, in a neighborhood too quiet to be honest, that Detective Artur's Ozolins received the call. His apartment on Brevibas Street had been dead silent save for the hum of the radiator and the occasional groan of old plumbing, and the voice on the phone, dry, official, a touch too calm, pierced the air with the weight of something dreadful. A body had been found near the old port district, inside one of the abandoned Soviet-era warehouses that loomed along the Daugava River like rusted-out bones from a forgotten war. Arturs lit a cigarette and didn't speak for a few seconds, letting the nicotine touch his blood before responding. He had seen too many bodies in this city to be easily rattled, but something about the location made his chest tighten. The port had always been a quiet place for dirty deeds. Smugglers, traffickers, and black market fixers had haunted its shadows since the late 90s, and while the EU had polished Latvia's public image, the underbelly remained, as dark and primal as the Baltic waters themselves. When he arrived at the warehouse, the wind cut through his coat and turned his face raw. The building, long disused, was flanked by broken fencing and tagged in angry Cyrillic and Latvian graffiti. The steel doors groaned as he pushed through, stepping inside to find Officer Rainey's already on scene, pacing near a plastic sheet draped across the floor. One overhead lamp buzzed and flickered like a dying insect, casting a cone of sickly light across the concrete. The body lay half-curled, face obscured, but even at a glance Arturs could tell the victim was young. Female. Local. Maybe not more than 25. Rainey's cleared his throat and motioned with his pen. No ID on her. No purse. Looks like blunt force trauma to the back of the head. No sign of struggle nearby, but we found drag marks, probably moved post-mortem. Arturs crouched, careful not to let his breath fog over the scene. The woman's jacket was open, her blouse torn, and bruises bloomed along her collarbone like ink beneath the skin. Her hands, however, were clean. No defensive wounds. No broken nails. She hadn't fought, or she hadn't had the chance. He glanced at the floor, concrete smeared with what looked like salt and sawdust. A crude effort to soak up blood, maybe. The killer had tried to clean something. That, or hide something. He stood up slowly and looked around the vast space. Empty pallets. Graffiti. Beer cans. Someone had been squatting here, maybe several people, but the dust patterns showed that whatever happened, it was recent. Less than 24 hours. We need forensics to sweep everything, print lifts, clothing fibers, blood samples, and check missing persons reports from the last 48 hours. She's local. I can feel it. Rainey's hesitated. There's something else. We found a phone. Not hers. We're guessing it belonged to whoever brought her here, or maybe someone she was with. It was wedged behind a crate. Old Nokia model. Burner. But it had one number saved. Just one. Artur's raised an eyebrow. And Rainey's handed him a slip of paper. A number scrawled in blocky digits. No name. No address. Just the number. Artur stared at it for a moment, mind turning over possible angles. A burner phone with one contact only meant one thing. Someone had something to hide. Either the killer was meticulous, or this was part of something larger. This didn't feel like a lover's quarrel or a drug overdose. No, this was cleaner. Purposeful. Planned. Get it traced. And see if any nearby CCTV picked up traffic last night. Maybe we'll get lucky. Later that night, back in his dimly lit office, Artur stared at the evidence board, now bearing the blurry Polaroid of the woman's face. Her features had been delicate once, sharp cheekbones, Baltic skin tone, ash blonde hair. But death had already begun to mar those details. As he sipped his bitter coffee, he found himself wondering, not just who she was, but why this death felt different. In a city like Riga, death was often random. A drunk brawl gone too far. A junkie who pushed his luck. But this was ritualistic in its own way. Controlled. And that kind of control belonged to organized hands. He called Alina, his contact in the organized crime unit. She picked up on the third ring, her voice thick with sleep, but instantly alert. I thought you'd gotten tired of calling me after dark. I need a favor, he said, ignoring the bait. Girl found dead in the port. Staged, almost. No ID. But there was a burner phone at the scene. Number saved on it. It means something. I need to know if it connects to any of your guys. Russian crew. Baltic syndicates. Anyone. She exhaled. Text me the number. I'll run it through the logs. Might take a few hours. Thanks. And Alina, this one doesn't feel random. If there's chatter, anything about a girl, a body, or the port, let me know. After he hung up, he looked out his window, beyond the rooftops dusted in frost, and toward the dull horizon where the city's industrial veins still pulsed in silence. There had always been two Rigas, one that tourists wandered, all cobblestone and charm, and one that lived in the cracks, in the old Soviet wires and rusted docks, where crime wasn't a question of morality, just economy. Artur's had spent his whole career walking between those worlds, pretending the borders were clear. But tonight, those borders blurred again, and someone was about to bleed for it. The next morning cracked open under a sky the color of rotting pearl. Clouds sagged low over Riga, pressing down like an omen. Artur stood on the sidewalk outside the forensics lab, his collar turned against the biting wind, his second cigarette of the day cupped in his gloved fingers. Inside, the body was being examined, hands dissected, fingernails scraped, blood swabbed. He didn't envy them their task. There was something particularly haunting about seeing the dead made clinical, as if all that remained of a life was a sequence of testable hypotheses. Still, he needed answers, and dead girls didn't talk. A low growl of a diesel engine drew his attention. A matte gray Skoda with tinted windows coasted to the curb. Alina stepped out, hair twisted up in a bun, eyes hidden behind mirrored aviators. She moved with the cool confidence of someone who knew the lines of the city better than most priests knew scripture. You said this was urgent, she said, brushing a lock of wind-loosened hair back behind her ear. And you were right. Artur's dropped the cigarette and crushed it under his boot. Talk to me. She pulled a folded page from her coat pocket and handed it over. The number from the burner phone. It's linked to a ghost line we've been watching. Not actively used, but it pinged a cell tower 2 nights ago. Same area, Old Port. The number belongs to a shell company registered in Liepaja. But the interesting part is who's been using that number to coordinate. He scanned the document, eyes narrowing. Name. She hesitated. Not confirmed, but chatter points to a man called Crusts. Street name, not his real one. Used to be with the Russian crew out of vent spills. Then vanished about 5 years ago. Word is, he resurfaced last year, operating independently. Smuggling mostly people, guns, the usual. But lately, whispers say he's doing something new. Something clean, structured. Less Bratva, more corporate. Crusts, Artur's repeated, the word sour in his mouth. Cross. That was what it meant. Not just a name, an omen. The man was a myth in police circles. A fixer who disappeared like smoke and re-emerged behind mirrors. The kind of man who didn't leave bodies unless they sent a message. Why here? Why now? Alina shrugged. Could be territory. Could be leverage. The dead girl might have seen something. Or said no to the wrong offer. He folded the paper and slid it into his coat. I need to find him. Quietly. Then follow the phone. He may have tossed it, but he'll have backups. Look for the pattern. Crust doesn't work in chaos. He builds it from precision. Think like an architect, not a thug. As she pulled away in her car, our tours returned inside. The lab was quiet save for the hum of overhead lights and the tap of latex gloves. The forensic pathologist, Ilse, glanced up from her workstation. You're in luck, she said, gesturing toward a tray. We lifted partial prints from the inside of the girl's jacket pocket. Also found something interesting in her throat. Our tours frowned. Her throat? Ilse nodded, stepping aside to reveal a small evidence bag with a fragment of what looked like blue thread. Woven synthetic, lodged near the vocal cords. She either bit it or was gagged with it. My guess? Gagged, then dumped. Cause of death remains cranial trauma, but this suggests restraint. Planned, not improvised. Our tours stared at the thread. Uniform fabric? Close. Industrial, maybe from gloves or workwear. He left the lab with a weight building in his chest. This wasn't just a random kill. It was clinical, almost professional. He spent the rest of the day tracing CCTV footage along the Port District, frame by grainy frame. Around 2:13 a.m., one of the street cameras captured a van, dark blue, no plates, turning onto the access road near the warehouse. A shadowy figure moved behind the wheel. Less than 20 minutes later, the van left again, lighter, faster. The timestamp fit the estimated time of death. The van was their key. By nightfall, our tours found himself on the eastern side of Riga, near an old mechanics lot notorious for servicing clean vehicles, cars with fake plates, swapped vents, no paper trail. The man who ran it, Juris, had thick forearms and a face like gravel. He was sitting under a space heater in a corrugated tin office when our tours walked in. No preamble. Just the file slapped down hard on the table. Juris didn't even flinch. You always come crashing in like that? Our tours leaned in, voice low. Last night, someone used a van, dark blue, stripped plates, came through the Port District. Girl ended up dead. I know you flip plates and scrub engines. I also know you owe me 2 favors. Time to pay one. Juris ran a tongue across the inside of his cheek. You didn't get this from me. But there's a guy, Raymond's. He's been moving vans through here for weeks. Big jobs. Always night runs. Doesn't talk much. Pays in cash, doesn't haggle. Last one was 3 days ago. Might be your guy. Address? Warehouse outside Jelgava. Rents it under a fake co-op name. Don't go alone. Our tours drove out that night, headlights barely cutting through the fog. The warehouse was on the outskirts, surrounded by frost-bitten trees and crumbling fences. He parked 50 meters out and approached on foot, flashlight tucked in one coat pocket, his sidearm holstered but ready. Through a gap in the siding, he spotted movement, shadows, quick, deliberate. Then the sound of something heavy being dragged. He edged closer, quiet as breath, until he saw it. The same blue van, half loaded with black duffel bags. Nearby, a man crouched by a crate, smoking. Not Raymond's. Younger. Lean. Nervous. But what drew our tours' eye was the glint of a small blue cloth sticking from the man's back pocket, threaded synthetic. Our tours stepped forward, weapon drawn. Riga Municipal Police. Don't move. The man froze, cigarette dropping. Then he bolted. Our tours ran. Let's jump to next story. Story 9. Glass Teeth. Latvia, 2015. The snow came late in 2015, reluctant and ugly, like a drunk stumbling into a wedding. Riga was already slushed in filth, its alleyways thick with soot and neon fog, when the girl's body surfaced beneath the railway overpass near Moskva's forestate. It was a Tuesday. The wind was sharp enough to slice open knuckles, and a pack of feral dogs had been nosing around the corpse for hours before anyone called it in. When Inspector Davis Lepins arrived, he found the girl curled on her side like a broken bird, one shoe missing, a cheap silver necklace tangled in her hair. Someone had crushed her windpipe with expert fingers, but the rest of her was untouched, no bruises or struggle marks. It looked too clean, staged, like someone wanted her to be found and remembered just long enough to forget what she meant. Davis had seen his share of death, junkies, jumpers, knife fights that turned into amputations. But this was different. Not because of the brutality, because of the silence. It radiated from her. No wallet, no ID, no phone, no name. Only a chipped dental filling and a business card soaked in mud that read, in English, "GT Logistics, let us move what matters." That was all she left behind. Back at the precinct, the air smelled of instant coffee and printer toner. Davis peeled off his wet coat and tossed it onto the radiator. His desk, already buried in paperwork from a string of petty warehouse thefts, now had this girl draped across it like a funeral shroud. He lit a cigarette, knowing it was against protocol, and exhaled smoke toward the stained ceiling. His partner, Lean Grinberga, walked in carrying 2 folders and the thin-lipped expression of someone too tired to be surprised. "She's not in the system," Lean said without sitting down. "No missing persons. No recent arrests. Nothing. Dental records are being run, but don't hold your breath. GT Logistics is a shell, registered in Cyprus, run through 6 holding companies. No website. No tax trail." Davis looked up. So someone paid good money to disappear. Or to smuggle. He frowned, tapping ash into a chipped mug. "You thinking human trafficking?" She nodded grimly. "The logistics game has changed. They're not moving drugs or weapons anymore, Davis. They're moving people, refugees, undocumented workers, girls like her. Latvia's just the hallway now. The real business happens in Berlin, Amsterdam, Oslo." Davis leaned back, watching the snowfall turn greasy through the window. He remembered when Riga had been something else, dignified, if only in memory. But now the city felt like a facade. A skin stretched tight over rot, gangs that wore suits, banks that washed money, and behind it all, a new breed of criminals, white collars, soft voices, men who killed without ever lifting a hand. That night, they visited the address registered under the GT Logistics import office, a rotting warehouse on the edge of Kengarags, one of those places with broken glass for teeth and graffiti like screams on its walls. Inside, they found rows of wooden crates labeled machine parts stacked 10 feet high. The stench of mildew and oil clung to the air. But it was the floor that told the real story. Scuff marks, fingerprints and dust. And in one corner, tucked behind an empty power cabinet, a pink fleece scarf with blood at the edge. "Jesus," Lean whispered, lifting it with tweezers. "Look at the marks," Davis said. "Someone dragged her through here. But not recently. There's dust over the blood. Weeks old. And this place was supposed to be empty. No shipments since October." She turned to him. "That means someone's been running something under the radar." Davis knelt, brushing dust from a loose tile on the floor. Underneath, they found a trapdoor. A crawlspace, maybe. Or a holding pen. They didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, they filed the report, locked the scarf into evidence, and waited for a warrant. But both of them knew, in that unspoken way shared by longtime cops, that the paperwork was just theater. The real decisions were made elsewhere, in boardrooms, in parliament lounges, in the back seats of German SUVs. By Friday morning, the girl had a name. Christine Osipova, 23, born in Valmiera. No living parents. No siblings. Former nursing student at Riga Stratens University. Dropped out in 2014. Last known employer, a night bar near Metzium's. No social media activity after October. Her landlord reported she left the flat in a rush 2 months ago, told him she had a job outside the country. He hadn't seen her since. What was she doing in that warehouse? Lean murmured. Trying to run. Smuggled in and changed her mind? She got caught in the middle of something, Davis said. Maybe she saw something she shouldn't. Maybe she was the thing someone else wanted to hide. They went back to the bar. It was called Zil's Vilks, a grimy joint with blue lights and mold in the corners. The manager, a man with nicotine-stained fingers and no memory, said Christine hadn't worked there in months. She got into trouble, he said, eyes flicking sideways. Fell in with some people. Foreigners. Thought they'd make her rich. Names? He shrugged. Russians, maybe. Maybe not. They drove expensive cars and didn't drink. Just came in, sat at the back, talked to girls who knew not to ask questions. That was the end of that lead. But then, just after midnight, as Davis lay half asleep on his sofa, a call came through. Unlisted number. Male voice. Smooth. Latvian, but with an accent Davis couldn't place. You're looking for answers, Inspector Lipins, the voice said. You're poking around a business that doesn't want to be seen. Be careful where you step. Before Davis could respond, the line went dead. And just like that, the case stopped being about a girl in a ditch. It became a war. The next morning broke under a bleak sky, its gray light smothering the city like damp wool. Davis Lee Pin stood on the rooftop of his building in Perfumes, coffee steaming in one hand, binoculars in the other, his eyes drawn not to any view but to the idea of distance, how far things had spiraled. The call last night hadn't come from some drunk crank or attention-seeking crackpot. The voice had been calculated, precise. That kind of voice belonged to someone with reach. And money. The kind of man who didn't break the law. He bent it until the truth snapped like a bone. A man who could turn corpses into bureaucratic oversights. That meant one thing. Christine Osipova hadn't just stumbled into a dirty warehouse. She'd bled on sacred ground. Back at HQ, Lean was already pacing, her arms crossed tight against her chest. She didn't offer him coffee. She didn't have to. She threw a flash drive on the desk instead, her face a mixture of fatigue and contempt. That's from the security feed. We pulled off a gas station 2 kilometers from the warehouse. November 17th. Take a look. Davis slid it into the laptop, fingers steady even as his pulse ticked up. The footage was grainy, the time stamp fuzzy. But there she was, Christine. Alive. Nervous. She stepped out of the passenger seat of a black BMW with German plates. She looked around like she expected to be followed, then vanished off-screen toward the trees behind the lot. The driver never emerged. The license plate? Registered to a luxury rental company in Hamburg. The name? A known front for a Baltic logistics outfit called Rygas Varty Ltd. Rygas Varty, Davis muttered, rubbing his jaw. They're on the watch list. German customs flagged one of their trucks last year. Empty crates and a hidden compartment. And a dead Moldovan girl stuffed into the floorboard, Lean added grimly. Case was dismissed for lack of evidence. The driver disappeared. Literally vanished. Davis sat down hard. What the hell did she get herself into? Lean opened a folder. Photos, maps, dotted line printouts tracing supply chains across Europe like arteries pumping rot. I think she was going to blow the whistle. Maybe she was in it at first, smuggling meds, maybe women, and then tried to run. Tried to talk. And someone caught her. Davis said nothing for a long while. Then he stood. Let's open the trapdoor. The warehouse smelled worse than before, like urine and wet rope. The storm had cut the power, so they worked by flashlight, beams slicing through the dust like scalpels. They pried the tile up with a crowbar and found a hatch beneath it. Not old. Reinforced steel. New lock. But no alarm. Davis kicked it open. A metal ladder descended into a pit barely taller than a man's shoulder. The air inside was cold and damp. Along the walls, scratched numbers. Names. Slashes that could have been tally marks. And on the floor, scattered like discarded tokens, bracelets, a cracked mobile phone, a child's shoe. Oh God, Lean whispered. This was a holding cell. They found traces of blood, urine, human hair. The forensics team was called in, but already they knew what would come of it. DNA from people who no longer existed, names erased, records deleted. Ghosts. That night, they confronted the owner of Rygas Varty, a portly man named Alexander Bruveris, who looked like he'd been born in a sauna and preserved in Cologne. He smiled too easily, denied everything, claimed the warehouse was sold months ago, couldn't recall the buyer, offered them coffee with a friendliness that barely hid the contempt behind his eyes. You think you're the first? He said smoothly. You think no one's tried to clean this city before? Riga is like the Daugava, filthy, constant, and always carrying bodies. You don't change a river, Inspector. You just learn to ride it. Davis leaned in close enough for Bruveris to smell the rage beneath his skin. One day, someone's going to ride it straight to your front door. Bruveris only smiled and said, That's what Christine thought too. And with that, he was untouchable. Over the next few days, the case evaporated like morning mist. Orders came down from higher up, offices with frosted glass and names in German, Russian, English. Evidence got misplaced. Surveillance footage was corrupted. The coroner's report amended itself. Christine's cause of death changed from strangulation to undetermined trauma. Internal Affairs opened a file on Davis for unauthorized conduct. But Davis didn't stop. He followed a driver for Rygas Varty to a drop in Ogre. Just a warehouse filled with crates, nothing illegal, but the scent of something wrong lingering in the corners. He tracked a Hungarian contact to a guest house in Jermala and found a passport shredder in the back room. He spoke with 2 Romanian girls who wouldn't give their real names but thanked him with tearful eyes for not asking. One night, he sat on a bench overlooking the river, the air thick with rain and defeat, and he found Christine's photo in his coat. Her eyes were defiant. Not naive. Not broken. She hadn't been stupid. She'd been brave. And someone had silenced that. "Do you know what it's like?" he asked Lean later. "To realize that justice isn't even pretending anymore. That we're not solving crimes, we're filing them like receipts, like footnotes." She didn't answer. Just lit a cigarette and said, "We owe her more." The next week, Davis sent an anonymous packet to Delphi, the largest news outlet in Latvia. Documents, photos, locations, names. He didn't sign it. He didn't tell Lean. He just dropped it in a mailbox in the dark and walked away. The story exploded. Glass teeth, how Latvia became a transit graveyard. Within a week, 2 warehouses were shut down. Interpol began sniffing around. Bruveris vanished. His house torched. A body burned beyond recognition was found in a cabin near the Estonian border. No ID. But the teeth were fake. Porcelain. Shiny. Unmarked. Christine's case was never reopened. But whispers began to circulate. Of a girl who tried to expose something too big. Of a city that buried her. And of a cop who wouldn't let her vanish. In Riga, the snow finally fell for real. Heavy and white. It covered the streets, the alleys, the bones. It made everything look clean. But underneath, nothing had changed. Not yet, but maybe someday. Let's jump to next story. Story 10. Ashes of the Daugava. Latvia, 2020. The sky over Riga was the color of rusted steel, bleeding faint shades of orange into the snow-packed streets below. A frigid wind stalked the river Daugava, and the city moved beneath it like a beaten animal, numb, slow, tense with secrets. Detective Inspector Elza Kramina stood on the 5th floor of a shuttered apartment building in Moskva's forestate, staring down at the alley where a body lay folded in on itself like a forgotten coat. Even from here, she could see the frozen blood, dark and glossy across the cobblestones, as if the city itself was trying to hold the corpse down, trying to keep something hidden. The call had come in before dawn. Adult male, early 30s, shot twice in the chest, once in the jaw. No ID, no phone, no wallet. No one in the building admitted to hearing anything, despite the obvious noise gunshots made, even with a suppressor. Silence in this part of the city wasn't a symptom. It was a strategy. These people had been trained not to speak. War had long since moved from trenches to supply routes, from propaganda to bribes. In 2020, the battles were fought through logistics companies, cryptocurrency laundering rings, and bulletproof transport vans. And the front lines ran right through Latvia. Elza descended the stairs slowly, every footstep echoing off the cracked concrete like a hollow drum. Her partner, a former vice officer named Renars Berzins, met her at the bottom, his coat flapping open and a thermos of bitter black coffee in one gloved hand. His eyes were red-rimmed, not from fatigue but from anger. "They dumped him like garbage," he muttered, gesturing toward the chalk outline now obscured by the coroner's tarp. No one saw the car. No one saw the shooter. No security cams working within 300 meters. It's like he appeared from thin air just to die here. Elza knelt beside the tarp, pulled it back with surgical care. The man's face, or what was left of it, suggested he had been someone who smiled often. Not out of kindness, but confidence. She could see the manicured nails, the crisp wool of a bespoke overcoat, the trace of a tattoo on his collarbone. A wolf's jaw encircling a Soviet star. It wasn't street art. It was a mark. Russian Vori Syndicate. And not just a foot soldier. This man had rank. "Get a dental scan," she said quietly. "And sweep the whole alley for shell casings, metal fragments, oil stains, anything that doesn't belong." This wasn't random. Renars nodded grimly. Nothing's random anymore. By late afternoon, the snow had turned to freezing rain, slicking the city in treachery. Elza sat in her office at CD headquarters near Brviba Zaila, staring at the files that had begun to pile up again like they always did. In the digital era, crime moved faster than the people who enforced it. 1 minute, a cartel courier was tracked via GPS to a parking garage. The next, he'd vanished into the folds of the darknet and re-emerged in Belarus with a new passport and no record of arrest. Latvia had become a ghost highway between eastern syndicates and western markets, a country cursed by geography and crippled by corruption. She clicked through the photos they'd retrieved from the alley. High-resolution shots of the tattoo, the ballistic path, blood-spatter trajectories. One detail stood out, a peculiar burn mark on the inside of the man's wrist, shaped like a sideways 8. Not a gang brand, not a cigarette burn. Intentional. Ritualistic, even. She'd seen it before, 2 years ago, in a closed case involving the collapse of a shell company funneling euros to crypto wallets in Tbilisi. The symbol had been linked to a secretive tech broker network that called itself Infinity Grey, a group suspected of trading in digital identities, biometric forgeries, and zero-day cyberweapons. At the time, it had sounded like conspiracy theory. Now it looked like prophecy. "Elsa," Renars said, barging in without knocking. ID came in. Dental match. Name's Ilya Kosetkov. Latvian citizen, born in Daugavpils. But he's been living in Moscow for the last decade. Worked as logistics consultant for a company flagged last year by Europol, Phantom Baltic Transits. They supposedly moved luxury watches and automotive parts. But 2 containers went missing last spring. UN sealed. Disappeared somewhere in Liepāja. Elsa narrowed her eyes. What was in them? He handed her a printout. Hazmat manifests. Radiopharmaceuticals. Industrial-grade thorium. Her pulse quickened. You don't move that unless you're building something you shouldn't be. Or unless you're selling it to someone who is, Renars said. And now he turns up dead, dumped on our doorstep like a warning. She stood, grabbed her coat, and motioned toward the hallway. Let's pay a visit to Phantom's old warehouse. It was a decrepit building on the outskirts of Riga's industrial zone, near the port, where cargo came in under the guise of free trade. The air smelled like ash and diesel. The windows had been smashed years ago. Inside, the floor was covered in shattered pallets and soggy paper invoices. But it wasn't until they found the steel door in the back, sealed with magnetic locks, that Elsa knew they were onto something real. Renars pried it open with a crowbar. The room beyond was lined with servers, rows of black machines humming softly, connected by tangled cables, flickering with green lights. Some were still warm. Someone had been here recently. On the far wall, a giant LED screen displayed a map of Europe with red dots blinking at various ports, cities, border crossings. Elsa stepped forward and saw the interface shift as motion sensors registered her presence. A voice, synthetic and calm, echoed through the speakers. Welcome to Phantom Atlas. Please input verification code. She turned to Renars, eyes wide. They weren't just moving contraband. They were tracking it, in real time, across the whole continent. He stared at the screen, then at the crates lined up against the far wall. If this gets out, it won't, Elsa said. Not yet, because she knew, even then, what would happen. Files would disappear. Witnesses would recant. Internal affairs would sniff around the edges of her investigation, reminding her of jurisdiction, of political sensitivities. Latvia was a small country, and its strings were pulled by hands in Brussels, Moscow, and Washington alike. But Elsa wasn't trying to bring down a global network. Not yet. She just wanted to know why a man with a wolf's jaw on his chest and infinity on his wrist had come back to die in Riga, and who had wanted him silenced. The warehouse's silence was its own language, cold, mechanical, efficient. Elsa moved through the shadows with her phone's light sweeping across old manifests and coolant-stained crates, each label coded in Cyrillic and German abbreviations. Medical isotopes, optic-grade tungsten, encrypted RF transceivers. None of these belonged in a defunct logistics company, and every word she read stitched tighter the thread that led from Ilya Kosetkov's corpse to something far more volatile than smuggled thorium. Her instincts weren't screaming. They were whispering now, insistent and calm, the way they always did before something irreversible happened. And what chilled her most was the precision of it all, like this room hadn't been abandoned but paused. Renars cracked open a small crate near the back. Inside, under 3 layers of thermal wrap and foam, was a black velvet pouch. He opened it with surgical care, his brow tightening as the object emerged. A palm-sized cube of brushed steel etched with hexagonal grids. Unlabeled, untraceable, military-grade secure data hardware. These weren't USBs. They were vaults. This isn't from a pharmacy, he said, his voice low. This is the kind of thing NATO Black Ops bury in sand under satellite link-ups. Elsa took it from him, weighing it in her hand. She knew it was too late to back off. She could feel it. The room, the server rack, the map. This wasn't a dead op. It was still running. Ilya Kosetkov had been a cog in something bigger, and Riga had only been one node. His death wasn't cleanup. It was containment. And now that they had stepped into it, they weren't observers anymore. They were part of the variable set. Back at headquarters, Elsa pulled favors to get a data tech from the cybercrimes division to analyze the cube, unofficially. The girl's name was Sarmite. Fresh out of Vilnius Tech, hair dyed electric purple, and a hacker's stare that never blinked. She jacked the cube into a sandboxed interface and immediately frowned. Encrypted with custom firmware. Zero-day architecture. Someone put real money into this, she said, fingers flying across the keyboard. But I can breach the outer shell. Might take a few hours. You've got one, Elsa replied. While the decryption spidered through the maze, Elsa studied Kosetkov's financial records. Not the fake ones. The hidden shell accounts, the offshore transactions, the cash-heavy dead drops. One name came up more than once. Einar Rudzaitis, a reclusive Latvian venture capitalist with rumored ties to post-Soviet military-industrial contractors. He ran a think tank out of a brutalist compound outside Jurmala called Novice Pax, officially focused on strategic technology forecasting. But whispers on the ground said it was a front, a breeding lab for digital warfare tools too experimental to be commissioned through normal channels. And Elsa knew that's where she'd find her next ghost. By the time the data cube cracked open, it was nearly 3 a.m. The server bled to life with a mosaic of transaction trails, manifest entries, heat maps, intercepted comm logs. But one file stood out, a video feed labeled DN Viriga. It had no timestamp, just a thumbnail, a still of Kosetkov speaking urgently into a camera inside a cargo van. Sarmite clicked play. Kosetkov's voice, rough and clipped, echoed through the small room. If this file is found, I am already dead. Do not trust Novice Pax. Do not trust Einar. The shipments contain more than isotopes. They carry the prototypes. Neuroclouds. Remote architecture for cognitive override. This isn't about weapons. It's about control. Real-time obedience induction. They've tested it on prisoners. They want to sell it to clients in Asia and Africa. I tried to get out. I thought if I left the Moscow cell and returned to Riga, I'd be safe. But there is no exit. They're always listening. Even now. The feed cut off. Renars swore under his breath. That's why he came back. He thought Riga would protect him. Maybe even thought we could. Elsa leaned back, mind racing. It explained the burn mark on his wrist, an implant or a signal node, used to monitor or track him. And it explained why he had to die. Not because he was a threat, but because he became disloyal. This was no longer about smuggling. It was about ethics buried in circuits. It was about technology designed to erase the idea of rebellion itself. The next morning, they drove to Jurmala. The forest was skeletal, its birches like dead sentinels. Novice Pax sat at the end of a private road, hidden by pines and electrified fences. A drone buzzed overhead as they arrived, routine surveillance, or something else. Renars parked, but neither of them moved for a minute. This place smells like immunity, he muttered. They think they're untouchable, Elsa replied. Let's find out. Inside, the lobby was pristine and quiet. White floors, smoked glass, minimalist Baltic design. A receptionist greeted them with a rehearsed smile. Director Rudzaitis is unavailable, but you may submit your request for an audience. Elsa flashed her badge. No appointment. No request. We're going in. Security moved fast, but not fast enough. They pushed through to the inner lab levels where the real work happened. Behind reinforced glass, young technicians, barely out of university, tested neural feedback systems on mannequins and livestock models. One room was entirely sealed except for a single chair hooked to an array of glowing headgear. The screen showed brainwave spikes, and beneath the screen, in a folder titled Test Subject, Ike was a still image of Kosetkov in the same chair. Eyes open, mouth slack, pupils dilated. They had tried it on him. Then something changed. A shutter dropped behind them. The hallway lights cut. A voice, deep and accented, filtered through unseen speakers. You were not invited here, Inspector Kramina. And now you know too much. Renars reached for his gun. Elsa didn't move. She looked straight into the security camera above. You killed him. You turned him into your trial run. And you left his body in my city. A pause. Then, we removed a liability. Nothing more. But you're smart. You'll keep quiet. We all benefit from silence. Elsa stared at the lens. You mistake me for someone manageable. 5 hours later, the tech compound would suffer a mysterious electrical fire. The servers would melt. The security logs would be unrecoverable. And the project called Infinity Grey would vanish into classified silence. Never confirmed, never prosecuted. But in her coat pocket, Elsa kept the cube. A copy. And somewhere, deep in the Dagava's frozen current, something began to stir. Not justice. Not vengeance. Something older. The refusal to look away.